Most gracious and also our peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. Welcome everyone and Assalamu alaikum to UNSW MSA's final event of our Islamic Awareness Week. It's going to be an interesting event, it's going to be a big night, I'm sure you're all looking forward to it. Just before we get into it, just a little recap of the past week that we've had. So if anyone isn't aware, with the UNSW Muslim Students Association, every year we hold a little campaign that we call Islamic Awareness Week. So as the name gives away, we're just kind of trying to hold a few events. We've got a stall up at the library walkway for the past week, where we try to raise a bit of awareness about what Islam is. I'm sure I speak for everyone that comes from a religious background, that it's a bit absurd that religion plays such a big part in my life. It controls kind of a lot of what we do, it's central to who I am, but it's a bit of a taboo topic. It's a bit awkward to talk about in normal conversations. So the purpose of things like Islamic Awareness Week is to be able to have these conversations in an open environment, to be able to discuss with people of all backgrounds, and I'm sure I speak for everyone else that the discussions that we've had in this past week with people, whether they be atheists, whether Christians, whether Buddhists, about our belief, about what we believe, why we believe it, clearing any misconceptions about Islam, has been very beneficial for all of us, for the people that we've spoken to, and for us ourselves as well. And it's all culminated in this final event, which we've titled, If God Really Exists, Where Is He? So you guys might have seen we had a trailer for this event, where we interviewed a few people from different backgrounds, different beliefs, and we asked them what their thoughts are on God. And a lot of the responses kind of came back to what the topic is tonight. So is there really a need for God in this society? And I think that, I might be stepping a bit out of line, but I think that might be a better title for the talk. Is there a need for God? Do we require God for our society to function? People were discussing things in the video like, in terms of morality, society has progressed to the point that do we really need a 1400-year-old book to tell us how to live? Or our science has progressed to the point that we understand natural phenomena so that we don't need some supernatural being to be able to understand what's happening. So is God really necessary for us anymore? Do we need a God to tell us what our purpose in life is? And so to discuss that very key topic with us tonight, we've got two guest speakers. So one of them sitting on my left-hand side here, we've got Dr. Mohamed Ghilan. He's a Canadian, he studies in Queensland at the moment. For those of you who don't know him, he's got a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Victoria in Canada. And he studied around the world with various Islamic sciences. He hosts a podcast and a book club where he discusses these Islamic issues and how they clash with modernity, how to reconcile certain key topics, contemporary issues, a lot of which will be brought up tonight. And sitting on my right hand side, I've got Dr. Peter Slezak, who doesn't really need much of an introduction to most of you. One of the tutors here. He's got a PhD in philosophy, is that right? Has publications for almost the last 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. He tutors in the different fields of philosophy, philosophy of language, and I'm sure between the two of them, we'll be having a very lively event tonight. So how we're going to do this is that we're going to start off with a little introduction from both speakers. They'll tell us who they are, what their background is, and how that influences their worldview. After that, we'll be having a back and forth discussion about some key issues. We'll have a short 10-minute break for refreshments. After that, we'll come back for a Q&A. When we have Q&A, you guys will be able to message in your questions. I'll forward them to our speakers and they'll have a short discussion on that for about 45 minutes. And then we'll wrap up the night at around 8:30, hopefully. So I'm going to start off with Dr. Slezak. What I want from you just to start off the night is just a little introduction from yourself to tell us what your worldview is, what your background is, your experiences in life, and how they've shaped your worldview, how they shape what you believe in and why you believe in it, I guess. So I'll pass it on to you to start off the night.
Thanks very much, and I want to say straight away that I'm grateful for this invitation, and it's a pleasure and it's actually a privilege to come and have an occasion to have this conversation exactly in the spirit that you said. I think this is not a political meeting, but in the current climate, I think it's very important for all of us who are not Muslims to be available and to stand in support of the Muslims who are, I think, going through a very difficult time publicly, and I think it's an occasion for me to just express my solidarity with the Islamic people and the Muslims in the world. So that's relevant to say that. So on the issues that we're here to talk about, it's rather odd. I mean, I didn't know who was going to go first, but there's a sort of paradox for an atheist to go first because, in a sense, an atheist doesn't have a doctrine to articulate. The way I express my view is, my position is based on science and what science tells us. So, in a sense, when it comes to questions about God, I haven't got anything to say until I hear what you have to say, and you tell me what God you believe in, and I'll tell you why I think it's wrong. That's basically the position. Now, everybody's got a different view, and in the end, that's inevitably the atheist's position, because my beliefs, strong beliefs, are proportioned, as one philosopher put it, David Hume, according to the evidence. And to put it crudely, and formally we haven't got a lot of time, to put it into a slogan, if it's not in the science textbooks and the science journals, I don't believe in it. And that goes for a lot of things. And in this case, God is in the same category as all the other things which are not in the textbooks, not in the science journals. And for me, none of them warrant rational belief. Now, since you mentioned it, and I didn't prepare particular notes, so I'll just say a few things quickly so that I don't take up too much time and leave Mohamed to say his side of it. You asked an interesting question: is there a need for God in today's society? Well, clearly I don't feel the need for it, but it's not that I think God is irrelevant. Galileo, I've taught a course for years on Galileo, and Galileo had an interesting formula for the Catholic Church. He had a big battle, as you know, and he was promoting his scientific views, and the Church rejected them and was fighting with him, and he was under the Inquisition for serious charges of heresy. But he wrote a very famous letter to the Grand Duchess Christina at the time, and he made an important point. He said the Holy Scriptures, in this case the Christian Bible, which is part of the Islamic tradition as well, and the prophets of the Christian and the Jewish tradition, he said the Scriptures are the Word of God. But so is nature, so is the world, and so they can't be in conflict. And therefore, if it looks like the earth is not the centre of the universe, and there are things in the Scriptures that appear to contradict what we know from science, you have to find a way to reconcile them. And in the end, his way of reconciling them was that the Scriptures, the Bible, gives you, it's a book about faith and morals. Now, I can agree with that, because there's a lot in all of the religious traditions. Islam, as little as I know it, and I'm pleased to be better educated about that, but in Christianity and my own background, I should say, I'm Jewish, an atheist Jew, for that matter. But these traditions, the monotheistic traditions, all have a great deal of wisdom and a great deal to say about how you should live your life, and I can endorse a lot of that. I mean, I think one should think about it critically. I don't take it as the Word of God, but I think those instructions and the insights are very powerful and very worthwhile. So, while I don't think God is needed when we get to ethics, so let me say a couple of quick things just to hit some of these key ideas. So as far as God's concerned, as I mentioned, an atheist doesn't believe in God because there's not enough evidence. And by the way, one very important point is that I'm not an agnostic. There's a difference between being an atheist and an agnostic. A lot of people are agnostic because they say, well, we don't know the truth, so you sort of sit on the fence. But you're not an agnostic about many things where the evidence is not even. You're an agnostic when the evidence is equally balanced and you don't know which way to go. But most of you, I think probably all of you, are atheists about everybody else's religion except your own. You're not agnostic, and you don't sit on the fence about a lot of things. So the question in this case too is whether you sit on the fence, whether the evidence is even or whether it's not. So I'm not an agnostic. I think there's just no evidence. Okay. Quickly, when the arguments are put forward about God, there's a number of traditional arguments. I think the Muslims, actually, and you can instruct me and clarify this, they have a different emphasis from, let's say, the Christians. One of the key arguments is what's called the cosmological or first cause argument, and I think that the Muslims also accept that God is the creator of everything, and they have reasons which we'll undoubtedly hear. That's a famous argument about the first cause, and today the discoveries from science, from modern physics, the Big Bang cosmology, sounds very much like, I mean it is, a creation. And so that has apparently strengthened the views of many theologians, certainly Christians that I've also debated with. That's one interesting issue. I don't think the argument stands scrutiny, but I'll have a chance to talk about that later. Another argument, which I'm not sure that the Islamic tradition is as keen or emphasises as much, is the so-called argument from design, which is that the whole universe is the most extraordinarily well-designed and so-called fine-tuned, both in biology, which is a famous example. Everything in biology and the natural world seems to just work so perfectly. It couldn't have just been a random event. And in fact, in physics, there's a version of it, which is the so-called fine-tuning argument, that the physics constants are so perfect that if there was just one fraction of a decimal point out, the whole universe would fall apart. It wouldn't work. And so physicists, including some big-shot scientists like Paul Davies and others, have argued that this can't be an accident, and it shows an intelligence. Now, that's a very powerful argument. Again, I think it's flawed, and I'm not going to go into my versions of the mistakes, but these are arguments that are put forward that have to be taken seriously intellectually. Let me say one more thing about the moral issue, which I mentioned already. It seems like a paradox to ask an atheist two questions. One, where does your morality come from if you don't believe that there's a God? What makes right and wrong for an atheist? And the other question, which I always get, is when I tell people I don't believe in an afterlife and I don't believe in God, the usual question I get is, what's the meaning of your life? It's kind of a funny question to ask because, I'm having fun. It's like, it's an interesting evening tonight, I have an interesting life. It's a very funny question to ask, what's the meaning of my life? There's an answer to that. But as far as the morality goes, the direction of the answer is as follows. There are rational grounds to develop ethical beliefs which don't come, and I think myself shouldn't come, from a supposed deity who instructs or gives orders, so to speak, about what is right or wrong, because the question becomes how you know what is the correct view of such an all-powerful, lawgiver, a moral lawgiver. So I think actually one can come up with very important moral principles based on our love for each other, our respect for each other, and for human reasons, rather than for some idea that they're an order from some powerful being in outer space. So perhaps I'll end on that. I'll have a chance to say a lot more, but that's the sketch, roughly, of the atheist position that I think I hold in common with other atheists. And in a way, it goes back to the question, where is God? Well, I've been asking that question a long time, and I haven't had a good answer yet, and I come to the conclusion that the reason I haven't found a good answer for where he is because he isn't. So that's the position of the atheist. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question before moving on? Can you guys hear me at the back? Is this fine? You can. No, it's alright, sorry. Just it'll be awkward moving back in front. Just before moving on, just to clarify one thing. You mentioned at the start just about science being the basis for your beliefs, if you want to use that word, and the lack of proof for God. Just to clarify, do you require there to be physical evidence for some to know that something exists, or?
Look, it's a good question. Let me try and answer it quickly. I require evidence. It's not always physical because science is very complicated. And look, when you found out that the whole universe began, 13.5 billion years ago, there's lots of evidence for lots of things. We know the structure of the atom through quantum physics. Science is amazingly subtle. I'm glad you asked me the question because I think we underestimate the power of the scientific method, so to speak. I think there's no real scientific method, but the scientific enterprise is the most overwhelmingly powerful source of our knowledge about the world. And that's why I rely on it. So yes, I need evidence. Because the obvious question is back to you. If you don't need evidence, what do you believe? Why would you believe anything? And I don't think there's a good answer to that.
So Dr. Ghilan touched a lot on science and the requirement for proof to believe. I know you come from a strong scientific background, your PhD is in neuroscience, you study medicine. How does that sit in with you in terms of your experiences and your belief?
Well, before I address this, just a couple of things. It might look to you guys that I'm being disrespectful, but the mic is really short, so I have to lean back. Also, the other thing is I look like I'm shaking in my boots because I'm afraid, but the air conditioning is directly on my head. So that's why I'm shaking right now. And I'm not texting, I'm taking notes. So just to let you guys, I'm not being disrespectful here.
Do you want a jacket?
I'm alright, man. Thank you. I'll persevere through this. I'll persevere. It's good. The question that Peter posed about, or the position that he posed, which is, it's odd for me as an atheist to begin when I need to wait for the religious person to tell me what God is and who God is, and then I would disprove it for you or just refute it for you. But then he made the statement about, well, I believe in science. If it's not in a scientific textbook, if it's not in a scientific journal, then I don't believe it. The immediate question that comes to my mind is, what is science? Because it's not. No, it's a serious discussion, guys. I want to know what is this thing called science? And, you hear, it's really fun. I like picking out these peculiarities in these in titles, grabby titles. Science tells us that blah, 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 blah. Science has proven this, science has proven that. Islam says this and that. And I'm sitting there, when I read these titles, I'm like, I've never met this guy named Science and this guy named Islam. And I'd love to meet these two guys, because they talk a lot. What we actually have are people. Even when Mohamed made the point earlier about religion runs my life. Religion does not run your life. You are informing your behavior based on some principles that have been articulated, that you believe were articulated through religious doctrine. oftentimes, from a religious point of view, or from a cultural point of view, what you think are religious principles, and this goes for a lot of Muslims, if you break it down, and if you study the tradition, you find that there are a few things that are not necessarily religious per se. They're informed by cultural upbringing and things like that. And so when you study the tradition, that you discover maybe this is not necessarily a religious thing, but you have to study and engage with it. Similarly with science. Why do you believe these things are religious anyways, to start off with? Just to start off the religious side. Why do you believe that these things are religious principles? It's because you put your trust and faith in a community, and this community has told you these things are the religious principles through which you run your life. And it's not until you go and study that you begin, and those of you who have studied, Muslims who have studied the tradition a little bit, one of the first experiences you will have with your family especially is increased conflict. And it's not because you're becoming extremist or you're becoming radicalized. It's because all of a sudden things that they thought were just taken for granted, you're now having a discussion about them. So for example, something that just shocked my mother, I remember when I first told her this, because when I started studying theology, the question is, can God do anything? And I said, no, he can't. And you say that to a lot of Muslims, God does everything. No, he can't. He can't do anything. You can make nonsensical statements and then attach to it, God can do this. You just made a nonsensical statement. God cannot do the impossible, the intrinsically impossible. It's just an example of that. Same thing with religion, for example, when it comes to how you conduct your prayer, how you conduct your fasting, when you do these rituals, for example, that many Muslims who are practicing will just adhere to with just fervor and say, like, it's got to be done this way. And then you come along and you say, for example, you don't have to pray this prayer at exactly this moment. You can delay it to this time or to that time, and you can start to introduce these nuances that to the unlearned it becomes, wait a minute, I thought that this was rigid and you can just do that. So there's a difference between saying religion tells me to do this, this, and that, and there are some principles that are given to us through religious doctrine that we guide our lives by. We trusted a community to tell us about these things, and we just go along with it. In the same vein, when somebody says, if it's not in a scientific journal, it's not in a scientific textbook, and I'm not subtweeting here. When Peter says that, what he's actually telling you is, though I have not done the science myself, I trust that this community of scientists, when they make a statement, when they release a report, for example, climate warming, climate change, when they all agree, I'm going to believe what they say. And the reason I believe what they say, he can list off a bunch of reasons for them. One of them, for example, is it's impossible for a bunch of scientists from different backgrounds, from different countries, from different parts of the globe, all of them to come together in a massive conspiracy and decide to lie to the rest of the world about climate change. So that's a rational argument for why you want to believe about climate science, for example. Other scientists come along and can make statements in the same vein, but then if you look at some of the research with regards to replicability, the crisis of replicability, the bias in publication, there are a lot of things that, just culturally speaking, our society, we just take science for granted. We just assume that this is the be-all or end-all. It is this absolute final statement on a lot of things. But when you go in the lab, and when you talk to the actual scientists themselves who do the research, by and large, you won't find this fervor. You will find people hedging their bets. You will find people saying they have their attachment to the scientific method. They don't have their science is not a thing, is what I'm trying to say with that. It's not a thing. It's a method. And this method, while it's great and it allowed us to achieve so many different things, its limitation is actually a human limitation. And the human limitation is that, to give you a practical example, I think it's according to the Department of Environment in the United States, before Trump is trying to dismantle it now. They have a statistic, an interesting statistic, which says something like 80% of life or 85% of life is in the ocean. And we've only explored something like 5% of the ocean. Now, if you take the significance of that, what does that mean? 85% of life is in the ocean, we've only looked at 5% of it. Now you're going to come and tell me that you understand life, you understand what it takes to generate life, you can make grandiose theories about all of life and just make a blanket statement about all life that has ever existed. Even when we speak about times, for example, like the universe is 13.5 billion years old. I'm not a physicist or an astronomer, but as far as I understand it, this 13.5 billion years is actually an indication of our limitation to how far we can observe to the edge of the universe. It's not the age of the universe, it's how far out we can measure. This is our observation of it, and it could be further than that, but it's not necessarily just 13.5 billion. It could be older. It could have started longer ago than that. We don't know. The bottom line is, when you rely on an empirical method, your limitation is going to be how much empirical things can you go and explore. And based on that, what do you do in science? You approach it with a scientific method, which we can talk about. He said he doesn't think that there's such a thing, but you can kind of, in a roundabout way, explain what a scientific method is. But what you do in science is actually investigate patterns in nature. That's all you're doing in the scientific method. You're looking at patterns in nature, and you're trying to discern in nature which patterns are you being duped by that you think are patterns. Like when you look at a cloud, or you look at a toast and you think it's Jesus, versus actual patterns that you can go and investigate and replicate and bring about and do all of these things. Now, when you investigate these patterns, what is the goal from finding out about these patterns? Do you really understand the nature of the universe when you get these patterns? I would say no, you don't. I would say what you understand are patterns. You can make some conclusions about the nature of this external world to some degree, but you always have to hedge your bets in the sense that, so far, everything that I've observed, everything that I've measured, using the tools that I have right now at my hand, using this great scientific method that I have, has gotten me to this conclusion. There could very well come 200 years from now, just like we today laugh at people that came before us 500 years ago. How could they believe these things? It's very likely that in 500 years, there's going to come another generation of people who are going to be sitting in another, I don't know what, maybe without their bones because nobody's moving anymore. Wally. And they're going to say, oh, look at people 500 years ago having a discussion about these things, and oh, look, and they might in fact laugh at us today for being so adamant about something like, for example, the theory of evolution. Because maybe something comes up later on and they discover that that theory it got us on some right track, but this is really what life is like. And then 500 years after that, and after that, and after that. What science offers you are ephemeral truths. It offers you things that you can work with, that you can believe for now. But from a Muslim perspective, theologically speaking, can you say that I believe, like when people talk to me, and I create a bit of controversy when I talk about evolutionary theory, because I tell people, I accept the theory. It's a scientifically valid theory. It's as good of a theory as you can get, but what is the evolutionary theory? It's a paradigm, it's a model. It's a model that explains the emergence of life on Earth, and it explains the diversity of it, it explains how it develops and evolves and moves on and do it. But it's a model. It's a human construct. I don't believe it. I accept it. When you talk about belief, now you're talking about theological things, you're talking about truth, and you're asking me to believe a human construct that could change at any moment with a major discovery, which is what every scientist worth his salt is trying to do. Just like every philosopher worth his salt is trying to do. You don't make yourself a name in philosophy by repeating what everybody else is saying. You do it by highlighting, flaws in arguments and coming up with discoveries in philosophy that can give you a name, and then all of a sudden you're the big guy on the block or the big lady on the block. Same thing when it comes to science. You're trying to punch a hole through something. Sometimes the paradigm is so big and it's so powerful and it's so good that now when somebody comes to me and says, I don't believe in evolutionary theory, I don't think it's true because I have these beliefs about what religion tells me about it, my first question is, what alternative do you have? Because this world is, if I'm investigating it as patterns, as things that are objectively available for me to understand and investigate, what alternative do you have? You can't just come and say, I don't believe it. And secondly, can we investigate this thing about religion that you think it says? Because oftentimes, what you think it says is just like I mentioned at the beginning, cultural inheritance. You thought it says this, but it's not necessarily that it says that. And it requires study, and it requires focus, and more importantly, it requires a little bit of intellectual courage to sometimes step out of line and say, what you think is true is not really true. You know what I mean? So I'll just leave it at that for a little bit.
Just a question on all of that. I think the biggest point that you made was that we're relying a lot on human knowledge to understand the world. and the limitations of human knowledge is limited, and we don't know everything there is. For example, the marine life. Would you not be able to apply the same thing to religion and say, well, to believe in Islam, for example, you're relying on the ability of humans to know beyond the universe, not just what's in the universe?
You're asking about the role of reason, for example? We're relying on human knowledge for that?
In a sense, for example, for humans to understand who their creator is for you to be able to...
So, okay, that's a good point that you bring up, because for the point that Peter made, the cosmological argument, the argument from design, fine-tuning, my dear fellow Muslims, you do not begin with nature to prove God exists. Period. So all of these things are interesting activities that... so theology in Arabic, the field of Islamic theology, the Arabic word for it is kalam, which, if you translate it into English, it just means talk. And there's an indication from that. Why did they call it kalam, talk? What they're saying is that this is how you would express your belief. But that's not necessarily the argument for your belief. That's just how you would express it. Given that, recognize that you're going to have flaws in that. Now, if you elevate nature to be your guide, argument from design, cosmological argument, what you're actually doing when you do that, it's an interesting, subtle thing that people do. You're elevating your intellect to such a point, you're elevating nature to such a degree, you're making it greater than God Himself. And you're going backwards. From a Muslim perspective, you start off with pure reason that God exists through pure reason arguments. Once you establish that, then you go into nature. So it's a backwards argument. Rather than saying, I see design in nature, because you don't see design in nature. You have an apprehension that is limited by your intellect, that you think is design, and all it needs is additional information for you to change it, and if it's going to change, it's not truth anymore. It's just practical. It works for now. So what do? You have to establish that God exists a priori. How do you establish that God exists a priori? This is where philosophers will argue that you can't do that because you are a product of this nature and whatever arguments that they can have about it. We can talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So I'm not going to put words into Peter's mouth, but you have to begin with an a priori position. God exists, therefore, then you see all of these different things. If you start off with God doesn't exist, you will start to come up with a different worldview. What is the role of faith or belief or, if you don't have to have this jump that you make that is not necessarily empirical. That's why it's interesting when in the Quran, towards the end of chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Jesus Christ is asked by his what is it called? What's the term?
Disciples.
The disciples, sorry. I've been up since 2:30, guys. He was asked by his disciples to give them the Last Supper. Get God to reveal, to bring down to us the supper as proof that God definitely exists and we want this miracle. So Jesus Christ asks God to do this. And God says, if I do this, this is your definitive proof. Now, if you disbelieve in me after that, now you're going to get punishment that nobody else has ever received because you're not using your intellect, you're not using your free will. I've taken your free will away from you in that way. If that's what you're looking for. We can talk about it a little bit later. So, anyways, I don't know where I was going with that. I'm just saying.
Jump in and respond. Look, let me figure out where to start with all this. For most of what you said, I was nodding my head because I was wondering where we're going to disagree, because I agreed with a lot of what you said.
Okay.
So we're going to figure out where we disagree, right? And it was at the very end, obviously. Because, let me just point to where we agree. You said a lot of things about science which are sort of exactly right. I mean, but of course at the end you want to suggest that there's more and you've got the a priori stuff and as you anticipated. I'm going to ask you, where did that come from? You're going to have to answer that. Let me actually deal with that straight away, because I'll get back to some of the interesting things that I think are correct that you did say about science. Look, science and what we know about human knowledge suggests, and leading philosophers have made this point repeatedly, to put it a bit simply, there is no such thing as a priori knowledge about the world, because the world can't be known in that way. We can have a priori knowledge about, or certain truths, which I think is what you want, when it comes to mathematics. Because mathematics is not an empirical discipline, it's not about the world. It's about necessary truths, which are necessary because there are various theories, but they're you might say, true by definition. There's an elaborate apparatus of conceptual truths that are true, like bachelors are unmarried men. It's just true by definition. So, but that category has been standardly by philosophers. I mean, if you do a class in philosophy, it gets a bit more complicated, but I'm giving a simple version. But as far as things about the world are concerned, things we would call empirical or synthetic knowledge about things, you can't have a priori knowledge about what's going on in the world. You can only have empirical knowledge. So, to get back to your first point, although you're right about the ways in which you describe science as a human enterprise, the fact is we don't have anything better about the world. And if you've got a priori knowledge, it's not about the world. So let me get back to some of the things that I think are very important that you said. You asked, interestingly, you used an interesting phrase. You started off by saying, what is this thing called science? I don't know if you know, there's an Australian philosopher who wrote a textbook exactly called that. Chalmers, Alan Chalmers.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah, and you were also correct that it's a social institution and it's flawed, and there is no such thing as a kind of an algorithm or a method that guarantees producing scientific results. But let me, in a word or two, indicate what the strength of it is. The strength of it is precisely that it doesn't give you certainty. It sounds like a weakness, but the fact that it doesn't give you certainty means that it's revisable. And it means exactly as you said. Next year, we're going to find out something that we didn't know, and we'll revise our view. And we'll have a stronger view, and whatever you may want to dispute with a physicist about whether it was 13.5 billion years or whatever, at the moment, let's assume for the sake of discussion, I think it's the best theory, but we don't claim more than that. We claim it's our currently overwhelmingly the best theory. Now, actually, I'm sorry if you want more than that, but you just don't get that. You don't get it, except I always joke to the Christians, you get it in church or perhaps in the mosque. But in the world, science doesn't, but that's not a weakness. So, the history of it comes in the following way. I teach a class on this, and we start with where all the histories of science start, is with the ancient Greeks, at least in the Western tradition. And one of the things that they discovered, famously with Thales and so on in ancient Asia Minor, the tradition of criticism. They stopped accepting authority because it was some authority that gave you what is allegedly the truth. And it was the introduction of the critical spirit, which challenged, as you at the very end even suggested, even with Islam, and you suggested that, but that's exactly what makes the scientific spirit. Now, the scientific practice and institutions, they have a very interesting feature that while individual scientists may be dogmatic and bigoted and stick to their theories regardless of the evidence, the institution embodies a kind of critical, skeptical tradition. And that's what makes progress, because you'll find, and if you look at the revolutions, why did we end up giving what was deeply authoritative, the things I know a bit more about, the Ptolemaic church-sanctioned theory that the earth is stationary? It was difficult, but in the end, the evidence and the arguments overwhelmed, and we changed our mind. Now, those changes of mind are very important, but they're not absolute truth. Science doesn't claim that there's anything like certainty. And so you wanted to think at the end to talk about the difference between belief and truth. Well, there's no such difference, because we don't have access to truth with a capital T and absolute knowledge. No scientist or philosopher can claim that, because we don't have access to anything other than overwhelmingly or more or less well confirmed, warranted beliefs, and that's why it works, because we find out things.
But that statement itself assumes that it's true with a capital T.
No, it doesn't. No, that's not fair. It doesn't assume truth. It assumes exactly the way you spoke modestly. Let me pick up another thing before we have some more exchanges on it. You said something very important when you said, why do you trust the scientific community? And you're right about that too. Of course, I don't individually, personally confirm all of the things I believe, and I also accept on trust. But that trust is part of a complex system of second-order beliefs. I tell you, I do this in my classes in the last week or so. It's a bit shocking, you know. People accept things on trust and have no idea why they accept it. I mean, I've embarrassed a few students in my class in the last week or two asking them things that Galileo knew. You know, some of you maybe in the classroom will remember this. I asked a couple of classes, tell me what's going around what in the solar system. I've had a few students that have no idea. Well, I find that a bit shocking. Or I asked them what falls faster, you know, a heavy object or a light object. it's a bit embarrassing that they don't know these elementary things. So they accept things on trust, as we all do. It's just they don't know enough about what we ought to know. So you're right about that as well. But again, that's part of the complexities of a social system, and science is a social system. And somehow, for all its flaws, it has this overwhelming strength. And as Einstein and Bertrand Russell and various others said, there is nothing better. For all its flaws, and that's why I said before, it's in a way not fair to downplay the way, in a way, some of the words that you used. Ronald Reagan, that great philosopher and scientist, he said about the theory of evolution, it's just a theory. You know what? He's right. He's right.
But he's using it derogatively.
He was, but you're absolutely right. But you see, ironically, it's just such an overwhelmingly well-confirmed theory that. But my answer to you is that everything's just a theory.
Yeah.
Some are just better than others.
So I'll tell you, because I want to be careful with regards to, because we jump between different fields, theology versus the world. So when it comes to the world, I'll give you a couple of examples. One from the Quran and one from the life of the Prophet Muhammad himself. So from the Quran, the companions of the Prophet, they were wondering about the moon phases. They're like, what's going on with this? Like, they're desert Bedouins, they're seeing this thing change. And you have the Archangel Gabriel and God connecting you, and can you just tell us what's going on? Give us an answer to this. So in the second chapter, when they asked that question, the answer that came back was, they ask you about the moon phases, tell them that it's for them to keep track of time of the sacred months and that. So in the interpretation of that verse, the scholars that came afterwards looked at that. They said the way the verse came back was to redirect. When you ask questions to the Prophet, for example, he's not going to give you mechanistic explanations, which is the scientific explanation. He's going to give you more teleological explanation related to your religious practice, not necessarily to anything else. The other one was when he moved to Medina, he noticed, because he comes from Mecca, which is more of a commerce center, never really saw much of planting trees and palm trees and date trees and engaging in that stuff. So he noticed that they were doing the cross-pollination manually. And he just wondered, he said, I think it would be fine if you guys just let it be. They thought he was giving them a divine injunction. There's a divine commandment, let the trees be. Sure enough, the next year, flop, there's no crop. So they thought that, the interesting thing is how they thought about it. They thought that they were being punished for some sin, like, did we do something? So they come to him and it's like, well, you made this comment last year, at the last season, so we just didn't do it. And he looked at them and he said, Antum adra bi umuri dunyakum. You know more about the affairs of this world. This is not my role. As a religious figure, as a prophet, as a messenger of God, my role is not to tell you how to do your cross-pollination or to give you scientific answers about how the moon phases are taking place. And that's human endeavor. That is not divine stuff. So when you look at, historically speaking, from the Muslim side, we don't have this tension at all between the scientists coming up with conclusions. The tension always comes in, if it comes in, between scientists that stepped outside of the science and started to make philosophical claims about what they found out. So an example that I was talking with the guys outside earlier, Avicenna. His argument, Avicenna, was, he started to, if you look into his writings, he was using empirical arguments to argue against the resurrection. And he said, if you look into the laws of conservation of energy and mass and material and all of that stuff, the resurrection is just going to be in souls. It's not going to be in bodies. Which goes directly against an explicit verse in the Quran that says you're going to come back physically. Maybe in different forms, but you're going to come back physically with your soul in the resurrection.
Is that derived from the Christian tradition?
No, I'm talking about the Quran.
Yeah, but this is the resurrection of everybody.
Resurrection of everybody.
Yeah.
Talking also about, does God know the particulars or generalities? And the Quran speaks about God knowing even an atom's worth. It doesn't escape God's knowledge. But Avicenna said, no, he doesn't. And he was using his scientific background to argue, his philosophical background, to come up with conclusions that say, this doesn't work. So Ghazali comes afterwards in the Incoherence, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, at least if you haven't read it. But in the Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he highlights 20 different problems, and he says, I don't have a problem with your science. Religiously speaking, we don't have a problem with your science. what we have a problem with are extra scientific claims that you make about the world that you have no business making because your science doesn't tell you about them.
What's an example of that today? I mean, my position as you was just the science. I don't make claims beyond science because I don't think there is such a
So when you make a claim, for example, that God does not exist because the evidence is not there,
no, but
what does that mean?
That's not how I put it.
Okay.
No, see, that's a good question. I claim not to go outside of the bounds of science for the reasons I've indicated. There's nowhere to go. There's no outside.
Okay.
So that's why I started with careful attention to that question. That's why I said, you tell me what you think, and I'll tell you why I think it's wrong. I mean, I have to depend on your claim. So I'm not claiming. When I say God doesn't exist, it's shorthand. It's shorthand for what I said before. I believe. See, I could pick things that you also don't think exist because you don't think there's any reason to believe in them. I mean, I don't know, green men on Mars or some stupid thing.
Okay, what is God?
Sorry?
What is God?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
No, I'm putting it differently. You tell me. I'm not claiming there's a God. I'm claiming I don't believe in things.
The flip has been, the script has been flipped now. What is God?
That's not a fair question to me.
It is a fair question because when you make a statement,
I'm not the one who believes in him.
No. Okay. This thing that you don't believe in, what is it?
I'm going to tell you what I think you think, or what Christians think. I know what they think.
I don't want to tell you what you think. I'm just trying to figure out from you.
That's like asking me, what do I think is... let me pick a different one. I often talk about the Mexican god Quetzalcoatl. If you ask me, what is Quetzalcoatl? What the hell am I going to say? I'm going to say, well, the Mexicans say, because I don't believe in it. So it's not fair to demand that I tell you something.
No, why don't you believe in it?
Why?
Yeah.
Because there's not a shred of evidence in Quetzalcoatl.
Okay.
Let me ask you.
What kind of evidence? No.
Let me turn the table back on you. Do you believe in Quetzalcoatl? Of course you don't.
No.
Okay.
Do you know why?
And describe Quetzalcoatl.
I don't have to describe it specifically, but I can tell you generally speaking, it is a material entity that they've created projecting their own...
now you're talking like me.
So...
Now we're on the same side.
All right. So that's why
we can go home now.
All right, so that's what I want to know. Like, when you say like there's nothing at all, when you make this emphatic atheist, not agnostic, atheist.
Yeah.
When you look at the different gods that we reject, generally speaking, mythological figures, Zeus and spaghetti monster or whatever, all of them, every single one of them, regardless whether you come up with different names or weird names, they all have this human projection where we have created something that we can grasp.
That's right.
And so we reject it.
Yeah.
Rightfully so. Is there something greater than what you can grasp?
Probably. That's why we do science. That's why we do science.
No, hold on. Science is about what you grasp.
So you're asking me, is there something we can know that we can't know? Wait a minute.
No. Know, but you cannot grasp. Know, but you cannot comprehend. There's a difference.
This is a trick question you're asking.
Oh,
is there something greater than what I can know? That's what you're asking me.
No. Is there something greater than what you can comprehend?
There's lots of things I can't comprehend. Lots of things. There's quantum physics. I wish I could. I mean, there's lots of things. In fact, your question is very interesting in a deeper way. There are undoubtedly things...
guys.
Sorry?
I'm deeper than I thought.
No, that's not being patronising. I meant...
Just kidding, I'm just testing.
That's okay. No, there's a discussion in the literature that I'm interested in about cognitive capacity. I mean, this is sort of your area too. Yeah. And look, after all, if you look at other species, other organisms, there's limits to what they can do. I mean, a dog can't play chess.
Yeah.
Okay, it can't, and a mouse can't solve certain mazes. Mm-hmm. Now, since we're also biological organisms, it's clear that there are certain things, there must be things, that are beyond our cognitive capacity. So in a way, that's an answer to your question. The things that are interesting in science and in mathematics are things that are on the border which we think we can solve. So for example, noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe, what do you call it? That's a very transparent and soluble problem for a human cognition because it's not deep. The search tree is not deep. Chess is interesting for mortals like everybody because we can't search it's an astronomically large search space. Now that goes beyond, or it's on the edge of human cognitive capacity. It makes it interesting. Now that's a close analogy to scientific problems. There are many problems that are deep but just look like we can solve them, but we may not. They may be beyond our capacity to figure out some features of quantum physics or whatever. So, look, as a general, what you might say, inductive generalization from our understanding of the human brain as a limited, finite object, look, our eyes, there's things our eyes cannot see. Okay, so it's not an implausible conjecture to answer you as I'm doing. Yeah, there are certainly things that are going to be beyond human cognition, but that's not enough for you because you want to come back and tell me that you know something that's beyond what we can know.
The knowledge that I'm talking about is how do you know mathematical truths are true?
Oh, that's easy. That's easy. We have a proof. We actually go onto the blackboard and we write down a deductive proof. And the truth
you just put some chalk and some paint and...
No, that's not fair. No, it's not just any old marks. I mean, on the board.
Yeah.
No. There are rules of deductive logic, and
where did these rules come from?
They're cognitively, they're in a way you might say arbitrary. You could say they're arbitrary. You can have different logics. You can make it up. It's a game. Look, let me talk about chess. It's a close analogy. If you ask me, how do you know it's checkmate? That's like a theorem in mathematics.
Yeah.
Well, there are, you might say, arbitrary rules, but you have followed the rules from the first position to the last. If you cheat and you don't follow the rules, well, anything can happen. So I'm saying that mathematics is just like chess.
No, it's not. Do you know why? You wouldn't believe science if mathematics was just like chess. If it was just arbitrary stuff that you make up.
No, you're right.
I cannot publish a paper in any journal if I don't show my mathematics.
No.
And my mathematics happens to correspond with the patterns that I'm observing.
That's a really interesting point. So let me pick that up. It's an extremely good and interesting point you made. There's a very famous paper by the Nobel Prize winning physicist Eugene Wigner called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. One of the wonderful stories, if I can do it just like in a second or two, is Einstein's theory of relativity bears on this in the most interesting way. Geometry, a branch of mathematics, was Euclidean geometry, was this deductive, in fact a model of deductive reasoning for many people, and some mathematicians, because they're bored and they've got nothing else to do on a Saturday night, decided to muck around with the axioms. The fifth parallel axiom, let's pretend that there can be an infinite number of lines parallel to one line. It's bullshit, right? I mean, it's completely nuts. And the extraordinary fact was that when Einstein was trying to figure out how to explain the universe, it turned out that crazy Riemannian geometry, which didn't make any sense, described the universe better than Euclidean geometry. But that's important because, to go back to your point, it's the distinction between pure mathematics as a game and how it can be applied to describe the world. So then it's a description. So your point is right. Mathematics, as I answered your question, it's deductively true when it's mathematics. When you apply it to the world, there are empirical claims that it corresponds with.
Yeah.
So that's science as opposed to mathematics. But you asked me about mathematics. But that's not relevant because that's not about the world. Because you can have different geometries. They're not about the world.
Where did it come from?
We invented them. Literally, the guy sat down, let's pretend...
So you're telling me that I can come to you now and just say 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 because it's a game and I'm going to rig it now to not equal 2.
Yeah. And then I'm going to play poker with you and I'll get rich.
The thing about that is, when you make that claim, you actually step out of rationality.
No, you don't. You're just playing a different game. That's fine.
If you want to just play games, that's fine. If it's just a game. But we're talking about the real world existence as it is, not just some arbitrary, we were talking about psychiatry earlier, schizotype type of ruminations, Like we're talking about actual real things. When we're talking about truth, we're talking about rationality, we're talking about... So if you're going to say that these things are just arbitrary, that claim does not correspond with reality. It's just a statement that you just made.
No. But I'm trying to separate out the bit that is arbitrary, which is just what you call pure mathematics. But when you apply it to physics, the mathematical principles, they now have a physical reality.
Yeah.
They correspond to something.
Yeah.
Now that's no longer arbitrary, because that is, as you say, that's the real world. I mean,
so the question is, when we confirm it in the real world, when I say real, by the way, I'm not restricting real. I'm just talking when we talk about the empirical realm.
That's right.
And I bring in mathematics to bear on it.
That's right.
I'm relying on a priori knowledge about or a priori principles to tell me that this is real and this is not.
It's not a priori.
Otherwise, when I look at a cloud in the sky and it looks like Darwin, I can just say it's Darwin. Not just a random cloud in the sky that happens to correspond with a figure that I just
And then we lock people up with things too much like that.
Exactly. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like when you engage in science, the thing about science does not exist if there is no world. If there is no empirical ground, science doesn't exist. Science is this activity that we engage in, that we do, and for us to be able to do it, I remember the quote, I think it was Aristotle that said that, if it's not reliant on a mathematical basis, it's not science, it's art.
Okay.
Okay, so for you to say that I believe in science, that means I believe in mathematics. And when you say I believe in mathematics, that says I believe that there's something that's not arbitrary about them.
So let me give you an example. Okay, I'll give you an example where, in a way, the extraordinary feature of mathematical theories, when it's applied to science, can make you, help you discover amazing things. Just again, a quick snippet. So Einstein's theory said a couple of things which were just unbelievable and too crazy. One was, just before we knew the Hubble expansion and the recession velocities of the redshift and all that, his theory said the world is expanding. There was and he cheated. This is a famous story. He said, look, the world is not expanding. It's not going anywhere. And he put in a factor into his equation to cancel, you know the story, to cancel out the expansion. It turned out his theory was right the first time. And he said this was the biggest blunder in his life. Black holes, nobody could have seen or predicted, but the model, the mathematical model is now telling you about it fits the world so well that everything that the mathematical model said turned out later. Time slows down. All sorts of insanely crazy stuff which we couldn't have imagined. We couldn't have imagined. The mathematics told us. Turned out to be true.
You could imagine it.
No, you couldn't.
Yeah, you can imagine it. If I ask everybody to just close your eyes and imagine yourselves traveling back in time.
No, you couldn't have imagined what physics says.
No, you can't imagine it. What Einstein did, it did not break down principles of mathematics where he would say 1 + 1 no longer equals 2.
No,
even if he inserts that thing, that little factor that he inserts in there, it doesn't break down the fundamentals of mathematics the way that maybe you're proposing it to be. It's something that it works, and it allowed him to predict something kind of like, I can't remember the scientist's name, but when he dreamt up the hexagon for benzene.
Kekulé.
Yeah, so it was a dream, but it just happened to work out. Where did he get that dream from? I can propose maybe some cognitive ideas.
He ate anchovies for dinner that night.
Yeah, but he just had some things add up in his mind. He woke up and he's like, there you go, this is the structure of benzene. So the same thing with this one. He had a hunch somehow. It wasn't working out, but I can add this thing, and it wasn't breaking down mathematical principles.
No, it's not breaking down mathematics. But let me insist on arguing with you a bit about what's imaginable. So quantum physics is even crazier than relativity theory, although it's pretty crazy. And famously, Richard Feynman, when you tell people what's going on in quantum physics, it's literally beyond our capacity to imagine it. And his answer was, look, you don't try and imagine it, just do the maths. Because when it tells you insane things, particles at two different ends of the universe that are out of possible...
Do you read much science fiction?
No, because this is crazier. This is crazier than science fiction.
Because some of the stuff that science fiction authors write is so beyond crazy that some of the stuff that was written in the 30s we're doing now. And it's stuff that they couldn't imagine. The reason you say you can't imagine it is for a simple reason. It's that you have not had an experience observing something like that. So, if I go back 1,000 years ago and tell people, guys, we're going to get on sheets of metal. We're going to go up 13,000 feet up in the air. And we're going to fly across, and I'm going to go from Brisbane to Sydney in an hour. People would say, you're insane. We need to lock you up, you're crazy. We can't imagine that thing happening. Only birds do this thing.
No,
so you need to have science develop to a degree, to a point where you can start to get people's imagination.
No, there's an important distinction. If somebody told you about this crazy thing that you described, you just won't believe it. You couldn't believe it, but you can imagine it. Quantum physics, physicists cannot imagine what their equations are telling them. That's just a fact about modern science. You cannot even talk about it in English or any other language. Mathematics is the only way, and the mathematics keeps proving this insane stuff. We needn't get into a debate about quantum physics, but
does it exist?
I want to cut in for a second because we're getting very abstract now.
And what has this got to do with where we disagree about the real stuff?
I'm losing track. So I want to move on to something a bit more practical, something we can all relate to. For the sake of time.
I think the point that where we took off from that, I hate to take over from you, but where we took off, we were talking about, does God exist or does God not exist?
That's right.
And the question is, and I think it's all premised on the idea that potentially religion limits your ability to engage in science and accept some scientific truths that scientists can come up with, and so you actually regress a little bit. And science allows us to advance to such a degree that we don't need any of this stuff anymore and we can move on. Do we need God to have a functioning society? No, we don't. Do we need God to have good science? No, we don't. And then we just move on from there. From a Muslim perspective, let's just lay out the case for you guys. There is so much room available in the textual tradition Like, we don't have a list. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't just come in and say, here's how the world works, and you must accept it, and that's it. If you ask Muslims, what is your theological, what are you bound by as a Muslim? What do you have to believe? Absolutely believe. And if you reject this, you are no longer a Muslim. Nothing scientific is going to come up. It's going to come down to just a couple of things. That God is one. The Prophet is a final messenger. The Quran is revealed. It's the Word of God. You gotta pray, you gotta fast, you gotta do these things. These are injunctions from God. When it comes to the engagement with the empirical world, we don't have limitations of you can believe this or you can't believe that, and you have to reject this, and you can play with that. Where we disagree, it becomes more on inductions from scientific findings that some people would have, and then they would say, they would give, let's for example talk about human beings with the theory of evolution, the implications that are derived or induced from the theory of evolution regarding humans and human nature and what it means to be a human being, that's when Muslims are going to come in and say, we don't think so.
Let me, if I may, ask you about the specific doctrines that you think are essential to be a Muslim, and Christians have their own. You said God is one, Muhammad is his prophet, and whatever the third one was, there certain practices that you are...
Yeah, the rituals.
The claim that God is one is an empirical claim. That Muhammad was his prophet, that's an empirical claim. And my question is, how do you know that?
When you say God is one, when you say empirical, what do you mean? What do you mean when you say God is one?
You said it, I'm asking you.
No, you're saying, I said God is one, you said that is an empirical claim.
Yes.
I want to know, what does that mean?
Well, it's a claim about what exists in the world. It's not mathematics.
No, I didn't say in the world.
Well, somewhere. Let me put it, okay.
Nowhere.
The question is, where is he?
The question
I don't know where
wrong.
he is.
The question is wrong, that's the point.
Okay, let's forget the question.
Where? The point is, when you talk, okay, so let's just talk about God, for example. What is God in the Islamic conception? The closest companion to the Prophet, Abu Bakr, as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, he said, عجزك عن إدراكه والخوض في كون الإله إشراكه. Your inability to comprehend God is your comprehension of God.
That's a cop-out.
1 second. I'm going to tell you. Just walk with me for a second. Walk. We're going to walk on the beach for a second. I'll serenade you a little bit. So, your inability to comprehend is your comprehension. That's not equated to knowing. You said it is. We disagree on that. And delving into the essence of God, in other words, trying to break apart and do all that, that is a type of polytheism. Because it arrogates the human intellect to a position. When we talk about comprehension, for you to comprehend something, it means you have to be elevated above it. You have to encompass it in a way so that you can comprehend it. From a Muslim perspective, that doesn't work when it comes to God. God has to be beyond your ability to comprehend Him. When we even use the pronouns, him, he, that is just a limitation of language. The world exists out of duality. You have to have dualities existing. So you have to have the male and the female, the positive and the negative, the electron and the proton, and then all of the different... It's dualities that come to that bring existence into the world. When we say God is one, we're not talking about not even mathematics in that sense. We're talking about before duality. We're talking about total uniqueness, utter oneness, that is not divisible, that is not done in parts, that is not encompassed by space or time. Your intellect, your cognitive capacities, ever since you came out of your mother's womb, has been subjected to space and time. So you're limited by space and time in anything you think about. And that's why when you mention, for example, quantum physics, the things that they're coming up with, they can't even imagine or come up with, and they can just do it. They're using, I remember watching the documentary about the Higgs boson. I can't remember the title of it, but look it up, it's a really interesting one. And one of the scientists in the Higgs boson, the discovery of it, he mentioned something really interesting. And he said, towards the end of the documentary, this is the triumph of pure reason. It is the ability for us to propose the existence of something empirical, using this thing that is greater than the empirical realm, our mathematics, to say that this thing does exist and we just need... And what did they need to do? They needed to construct a massive, freaking large hadron collider that goes around, that gathers something like 10,000 scientists, like just a massive, the biggest scientific project, just to discover this one little speck on a graph and say, 5 sigma! And they go up and dance around for discovering this thing. But when it comes down to it, how did they even, when they said, we discovered it, we have it, it was still mathematics. It was a graph on a screen. And they said, this is what we have. Out of that, what do? We come up with applications later on, when we understand how to manipulate these things and work with them. So your intellect is able to know things, to use this mathematics. That's why I disagree so vehemently with you with regards to mathematics. It's not a game. It's a thing that you use to investigate things, to ascertain what is true from what is not true, to accept a theory and reject another one, to say that this is right and that is wrong in the empirical realm. That's mathematics. And you use that to govern and to guide your scientific methodology. So it's something that's actually above empiricism. So in philosophy, it's the big old debate between empiricists and rationalists. And so religious folk, typically you'll find them falling on the rationalist side as opposed to the empiricist side. And you find most atheists falling on the empiricist side. They say there's no priori, you can't get anything outside of the world, and so you can't, and that's where the rejection of God comes in.
I want to butt in and go back to something you mentioned a couple minutes ago. I know you're itching to respond.
No, I'm not.
I've got a few questions on that, but I'm going to move on from this topic just because we spent a lot of time on it. We're going to go back down the same rabbit hole. You mentioned a couple minutes ago about the requirements for a Muslim to believe, or to be a believer, I guess, to not step outside the fold of religion. One of the things that you mentioned was certain practices and certain rituals. Going along the same lines, for a Muslim to believe in their religion, it would be wrong for them to go against what their God has commanded. So going along the lines of ethics, which you touched on in the introduction. For example, God commands certain things, and as Muslims it's expected that they follow it. Would there be anything, because the Quran is a book 1400 years old, and society has progressed over that time, and you find people telling you that the book can't be applied today, would there be anything within that book? Is it possible for there to be something within the religion which would be considered immoral? So for example, God tells you, someone steals, the punishment for that stealing is the chopping of the hand.
I don't like the term moral, all of that stuff. I have a problem with these terminologies that we use because it presumes a lot of things and it comes with a lot of baggage. But what I can tell you is that, for example, the verse about the cutting of the hand and all that. If you look at the tafsir, what's interesting about it is that practice was actually present before the Quran among the Arabs. That was something that they did. And then you have Umar ibn Khattab coming later, and when it comes to thieves and people, not everybody had that punishment. He instilled, prison system comes from Muslims. Umar ibn Khattab is the first one to instill that idea of putting somebody in jail for doing things that broke the law. Is there anything in the Quran that you would consider unacceptable? We have rules about slavery. We no longer have slaves. So, even Islamically speaking, it is unacceptable because slavery has been abolished. So you cannot go back in time and then say the Quran has these rules about slaves, so therefore I need to apply them for me to behave in a way that's accordance with the Quran.
Having such a rigid text doesn't it open the path, because you mentioned that there's no path for slavery, or slavery would be something that's unacceptable in the modern day because it's no longer present. I don't know.
Well, it's present in different forms. But
that's my question. Yeah. So we do see, for example, in certain Muslim countries that slavery is practiced. Or for example, having such a strict code for your morals, doesn't that lead to possible extreme literal interpretations of domestic violence or slavery?
So it's not about the religion, it's about the people themselves. And if you look at whether it's domestic violence, whether it's slavery, it's all about how the person approaches the text. I personally have interacted with enough people that just from talking to somebody for a couple of minutes, I can tell you right off the bat how they will approach that text and how they will interpret it. If you look at the cousin of the Prophet, Ali ibn Abi Talib, he had to fight wars with a bunch of people who decided that they knew the Quran better than him. And he was the cousin of the Prophet who was called the gate of the city of knowledge. I'm the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. So, it's not the text itself. I mean, we can go around the text and say like it has this, it's rigid. It's not rigid. That's what I'm trying to say. Well, the rigidity that is being assumed of it is not there. It allows you so much room to. I mean, if you're going to say that Islam is valid for every time and every place, because that's what Muslims like to say, Islam is valid for all time and all place until the Day of Judgment. Okay, do you honestly think that Medina, which had a population of 20,000 people or something like that during the time of the Prophet, the way that they ran it is going to be valid for a city of 6 million people? with all of the different issues that 6 million people bring up with them, when you have a big city like that. Even when you look at the way that governance is done. The early Muslim texts, Muslim scholars, when they wrote their texts on Islamic governance, the majority of the texts, if you were to divide it up and see like where did most of the quotes come from? They came from Persian philosophers. Because they never had that. They never had this idea. They were Bedouin tribes separated across the desert of Arabia. All of a sudden now they have this so-called empire having to rule over all of this vast amounts of lands. The empire of Persia, the Romans fell to them. So all of a sudden now they have these realities that they're faced with. And they try to get things from the tradition, but there wasn't anything explicit. You have guidelines. So you have in the Quran, you have Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, for example, one of the scholars, he said, if you look at the Sharia, the Islamic tradition, it is all wisdom, it is all mercy, it is all justice, it is all about benefit for the people. And anything that goes against mercy, against justice, against benefit, it brings harm to the people. Against wisdom, it's frivolous. Know that it is not from the Sharia at all, even if someone tries to interpret it into the Sharia. So there is this understanding that the human intellect, Muslim scholars have always understood this, and you see it written across all of their texts when they talk about the Quran or the Hadith. They always say, this is the best I can do, this is what I can derive from it, this is what I understand. But there is this overall compass that they have to direct their behavior so that they live in accordance, or they can have a society in accordance with what they believe was divine ordinance. This is what we believe is the righteous way to go about things. Now, when you remove that from the picture, the only philosophy that works is utilitarianism. That is the only thing that you have going on. And so what do you do with utilitarianism? Maybe you can tell us that.
Well, look, what you're saying is extremely interesting to me because I find it admirable, and it's exactly the way in which great scholars in the Christian tradition, and perhaps in the Jewish tradition also, I mean, Christian scholars, I mentioned Galileo, he came to essentially, if I understood you, the same kind of conclusion. And the great figures of the time even said as much, Cardinal Bellarmine and the great defenders of the Catholic Church, had essentially your view that you have to interpret with wisdom the Holy Scriptures. So that's common, and as we know well enough, that's a wise and appropriate way for human beings to interpret these things. Wherever we may disagree, that's not the part of it. And anyway, so I think that's important and interesting. But you're right to ask me, so because I don't have a text and I don't have any interpretative approach to my moral values, perhaps I'll say just a word or two and see. You're right, utilitarianism is a kind of an alternative for me. The question becomes, what is the basis for ethical judgment, for moral judgment? And since I don't appeal to God, even people, Catholics I've debated with who appeal to God, there are two different ways you could go. This is famous in Plato as well. You could say things are morally required, or they're good, let's say, or obligatory, because God said so. God is giving edicts and orders. Or it's the other way around. God orders them because they're good. So they're independently good. Now this is a theological debate and you can go either way.
Muslims had the same thing, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris, exactly the same.
In the Quran, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Not in the Quran, historically speaking, two theological schools arose at the beginning, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris. And the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they had the position
Same
that God said so, therefore it's good. Mu'tazili said, no, it's good, that's why God said so.
These are very interesting issues,
yeah.
and Plato, who may be part of a different tradition, had the same issue, exactly. What is in the Euthyphro, what is a man's religious duty? And, okay, so I don't have that. And so the question for me becomes, where do I get my ethical judgments? Now, of course, this is a big subject, and moral philosophy is full of it, and I'm not a professional moral philosopher, but I've done my share of that stuff. And you're right, overall, utilitarianism seems to me to be with all its difficulties, intellectually, there are a lot of problems with it. The general principle, if you don't know exactly, it's the idea that the right thing to do, the morally good thing to do, is that act which causes or brings about the greatest good or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's a very admirable principle, after all. And everybody, to some extent, will agree with that, because it can't be completely wrong. There are paradoxes, because you can think of ways in which you could do a great deal of good and just make one poor, wretched, miserable person suffer a lot and make everybody happy, which you wouldn't think perhaps is the right solution. So I'm not suggesting it's a simple outlook, but as a general guideline, as you were saying too with Islam, there's a kind of a feeling here that something about it is right. And also it's based on some kind of rational grounds. You're trying to decide what overall is the best way for human beings to live together. Because in the end, morality, if you're on your own on a desert island, there's no morality. and it's a function of human beings who live together and want to go on. Now, there are lots of social and political philosophers that have discussed contract theories and how we come to cooperate, and these are insightful and interesting and important principles. The great book, modern book on ethics was John Rawls at Harvard University, wrote a book called The Theory of Justice. And he comes up with ways in which we decide what is a just society, what is a fair society. So, without going into all the details, it's clearly an attempt of people who don't have a religious basis. Not that there's not inspiration in these traditions, because as I mentioned earlier, a Christian tradition and the traditions we all belong to give lots of guidelines. Look, I happen to think that the Sermon on the Mount in the Christian tradition is a pretty nice guideline, and I don't know enough about Islam, but I think there are similarities, and after all, Islam takes a lot of it from.
So the question I would ask for utilitarianism.
Sorry?
The question I would ask for a utilitarian, for example, is what makes. Well, it just seems to me that the implication of utilitarianism is that there is no such thing as intrinsic human worth for the individual.
That's right.
Is that true?
Look, there's no intrinsic value in the universe. My Catholic friend, philosopher colleague here at the university, Jim Franklin, would argue that value and human worth transcends human life. It's some universal property. I don't even know what that means. I mean, values are human constructs, to use a word that you used before. If there were no sentient beings on the planet or in the universe, if you had rocks, if you had, the moon going around the earth, there'd be no values, there'd be no purpose. Purpose is something that is human. It comes from our desires, from our ambitions, from our wills, from the fact that we have a brain, we have goals. These are biological. I don't have to explain to you, you're the psychiatrist. There are mental properties that advanced brains have, which are purposive behaviours. And our goals in life, largely biologically, innately designed by evolution, give us purposes. Now, in the end, if you ask what is the meaning of it all in a cosmic sense, what is the meaning of life on the whole, there isn't one. I mean, I don't want you to go and slit your throats and your wrists when you go home after this.
We're going to nihilism, guys, now.
But like everybody else, I find it a slightly bizarre and uncomfortable idea that this whole thing is just this kind of cosmic accident. But I think that's intellectually the only possible, and it doesn't take away the meaningfulness. Let me just answer it like this. It doesn't take away what we think is important and meaningful in our lives, because they are part of human life, and they're no less real for the fact that they're human constructs. Their meaningfulness, meaning and purpose comes from us, but that doesn't make it unreal or unimportant.
I think it's because we can keep talking around in circles about this stuff. One way to address a question maybe is to look at the impact that the answer would have, right? So from, I want to lay down, because I don't know how long this is going for.
We've got 5-10 more minutes, take a break, and then we'll come back to it.
Okay. So I just want to let you guys know a bit about, when it comes to intrinsic human worth, for example. There's a verse in the Quran, لَخَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَكْبَرُ مِنْ خَلْقِ النَّاسِ. There is, the creation of the heavens is greater than the creation of human beings. There's these reminders in the Quran always to don't puff up yourself so much and think that you're all that. The creation of the universe is greater than your little piddly creation, so don't think too much of yourself. On the other hand, you have this nobility. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have ennobled the son of Adam. We have ennobled Adam and his children. So you have this kind of tension that is introduced in the Quran to recognize it to them. And when you say there's no value to rocks, Islamically speaking, everything has value. Absolutely everything.
To who?
If you adopt the initial position of I'm going to be a Muslim, that I believe in God, then everything, that's what I mean by implication. Let's look at the implication of a worldview. So, worldview speaking, which is kind of odd. I'm just going to use this example, because it's to this day puzzled me. Let's look at, because it's relevant politically speaking, the armament industry and how war is conducted today. If you look at what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said about war and how to conduct it, and the limitations imposed that are non-negotiable because they are absolute. These are not utilitarian things. In fact, they would bring about the demise of Muslims had they approached it this way, but there is no negotiation on this. And what Muslim countries have done is they've rejected these things. You cannot burn down a tree or cut down a tree. You cannot attack civilians. You cannot attack women. You cannot attack children. You cannot attack houses of worship. You cannot, even if you have somebody in battle and they're running away from you, you can no longer go after them. You can't do indiscriminate stuff. And these are like very adamant, vehement, like really explicit things. This specific tradition has the same authority as the Quran, and it's not open for interpretation. Yet, the biggest purchaser of weapons is what is called the custodian of the two holy sites. Right? So it's really fascinating to think of these things. So if, from a Muslim perspective, the engagement with, the problem I have with these debates, discussions and stuff is that human beings, we have this tendency to get lost into our own rhetoric and in our own minds and our own thoughts. But if you look at Islam itself, I'll just go back to Imam al-Ghazali. There's a short text I'd recommend you guys pick up. It's called Deliverance from Error. And it's his personal spiritual autobiography. Very short, very nice, straight to the point, but he explains how he attained certainty in God, certainty in the tradition, certainty in his beliefs. And one of the things he mentioned was, if you look at the way that we all try to apprehend or to comprehend truth and attain it with regards to religion, he said there's a problem with it, because we assume that we all have equal capacity to comprehend everything. And the analogy he gave was, if you look at engineers, look at physicians, look at these scientists, biologists, what you notice is that people have different intellectual aptitudes to gain access to fields of knowledge that not everybody gets access to. And we have an example of that here. Some of you might apply to medical school, some not get in, some get in. It's blocked off for some people, and so it's a field maybe not for you. Maybe some are great mathematicians. I'm terrible. We talked a lot about math, but math is not my forte. I did a degree in microbiology in my undergrad because I didn't want to do organic chemistry. So, I picked my battles because that was not my thing. So Imam Ghazali says, if you look at the way that everybody is, and you look at prophets, for example, as making a claim, the Prophet Muhammad is making a claim, that his claim is, I'm getting revelation from the divine. Treat it the same way that you treat all of these different other fields. That you are not going to personally comprehend what he experienced through revelation in that way. But he's telling you, engage in these activities, and that truth, you will start to experience it in a way that is not necessarily rational, but it's non-rational. Not irrational, it's a non-rational experience. So, if you look at Muslim practices, we talk a lot about theology and stuff, but if you look at what ultimately makes a Muslim, you have to connect with the creation before you connect with the creator, Islamically speaking. And it starts with the rituals. If you look at the so-called golden age, and I don't like the term, but so-called golden age of Islam, you read some of the introductions of these Muslim scholars that some people are trying to prop up now and say, look, we had the discovery of this and the optics and the algebra and all of that. Read the introductions. The majority of them said in their introductions, the reason I'm writing this, the reason I'm developing this discipline, which, funny enough, atheist scientists are using now, the reason it came about was because they wanted to solve a religious problem. So Al-Khawarizmi, for example, his problem, he was instructed by the ruler at the time. We have commerce expanding, we have the inheritance laws, things are getting too complicated and people are losing out. So we want to come up with a discipline, and you're the mathematician here, put something together. So he came up with algebra. That was directly from a religious impetus.
For Isaac Newton too.
Isaac Newton. So for a lot of these people, so that's what I mean by look at the impact. Now, if you look at, and not just Muslims by the way, because science is funny in the way that it goes from civilizations. And if you look at every civilization, with the exception of our current modern, and I'm not going to use Western because it's everywhere, with our modern civilization, all the science they've ever done was connected with nature in some way. It was always in harmony with nature. Those of you who got a chance to travel to Spain, go to Andalusia, go to Alhambra Palace, and ask about the fountains. The way the fountains were designed by Muslims at the time was using gravity to push the water up and bring it down through the fountains, and it was quite amazing. No energy that's externally applied, just using nature. Go to China, go to Mexico, go to Egypt with the pyramids. A lot of the way that the people did science was in accordance with nature. As above, so below kind of thing. The modern world, the way that we approach things is, first of all, we compartmentalize it, we break it apart, and then, because that's the scientific method, it's reductive in its nature. We look at specific parts of it, we gain a use out of it, we don't look at the greater impact that it has, and then we just run with it, and we think that we've got something, and then we talk about progress. Meanwhile, we got Irma, we got Jose, we got hurricanes that are coming out of nowhere, the coral reefs that are just dying out. Our impact, that's why I'm not, when I downplay science, I'm not downplaying the scientific method, I'm not downplaying the progress that it has. I question, when we say, do you need God for a function of society? Well, you don't need God to make iPhones and do all of these things, but you certainly need some external compass to guide your behavior in a way that reminds you, wait a minute, this is not yours. The term for human beings in the Quran is Khalifa. I'm not talking about ISIS stuff, we're talking about, you are a caretaker, a representative. This is not yours, including your body. It's not yours. None of this is yours. You're just here for a short period of time. You've been given this thing called free will, which everything in creation rejected, but you have it, and free will is the choice to behave in accordance with divine commandments or not, whatever you want. And if you don't, there's another verse that says, ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. Corruption has become manifest on the earth and in the seas. So now when you look at 85% of the fish has been depleted, you look at the hurricanes, you look at the earthquakes, you look at all these things that are happening, and it tells you in the Quran, بما كسبت is because of what you're doing. And then it says, and God allowed some of it, just to give them a taste of what the impact of their behavior is like. So we're not seeing everything. You think Irma and all of these things are like a big deal. That's, from a Muslim perspective, that's just a taste, and divine intervention is just stopping it from really getting out of hand. And the whole point of it is, people now come back and say, climate change, global change, we need to fix this. But the underlying philosophy of it, as a utilitarian philosophy, ultimately is going to be problematic because it touches on the same problematic issue when it comes to science. It's empirically based, it's limited. It's like a baby or a kid that goes and gets their vaccinations and cries about it, not recognizing that there's a greater benefit to it. Human beings, as limited creatures, empirically speaking, we don't have access to everything. That's where this compass comes in. It doesn't tell you explicitly about everything. Do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, like straight up. That's why the Prophet said in another hadith, حَيَاتِي خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَمَوْتِي خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. My life is good for you and my death is good for you. Because every time, تُحْدِثُونَ وَيُحْدَثُ لَكُمْ. Every time you do something, revelation comes and gives you a ruling. So imagine if the Prophet was alive today, how many rulings we would have over 1400 years. So it's actually a benefit that he passes away so that we can have our own intellect. I mean, why would God give you an intellect if you're not meant to use it?
It's funny about this. If I can just say one other thing is, I agree with about 95% of everything you're saying. We're sort of on the right side, or the same side.
I disagree with the philosophy underlying it. The cosmological worldview underlying it is where we disagree.
No, we even agree on the worldview. You've just got kind of an underlying principle which then becomes the motivation for it, and we don't share that. But actually, we agree, and I would talk the way you've talked for most of what you've said now, about the world and the
so
consequences.
Just repeat after me, La ilaha. You know what that means? I said repeat after me, there is no God other than God. I was going to get you to testify to everybody here.
We're going to have our break really soon. I'll give you a chance to just respond in a couple of minutes if you wanted to anything they said, and after that we'll take our short break. So you
we'll come back after.
No, we can continue afterwards. Yeah, that was a good place to end.
So the first question that we've got, it was one of the issues that I want to talk about, we didn't really have time for. Probably one of the biggest issues that we have in terms of the existence of God. So it's targeted towards you, Dr. Ghilan, about if God exists and if He is omnibenevolent, how do we explain the presence of natural disasters, illnesses in children, and so on? Why is there evil in the world if God is so merciful? And just to note as well, sorry, just to speak, if you can keep the answer short because we've got a few questions coming in. I don't know too much.
Let me give you this really, very big question. I'll give you a couple of sentences to answer. That sounds like a lot of our med exams. God is so merciful. Well, it goes back to this idea of about the Islamic tradition that's really interesting is this business of always reflect on yourself first before you start to project anything externally. So when it comes to and question your assumptions themselves, like where is this question coming from? What is the difference between you just having some sort of an emotion about it, which is valid, it's fine, you have a feeling about this thing that it's terrible or whatever, but I'm failing to think of, because there are examples out of so many different disasters and things that are terrible, we discover things. So look at a disease, for example. So much of medicine is rooted in deformities. It's rooted in, and a lot of science, it's rooted in things going wrong. And then that turns our attention into, wait a minute, what is the function of this thing? The question you ask is, what do you expect out of God, for example, for the world? Like, are you expecting a perfect world? That's what you want? You want a place where you live forever?
Yes.
Okay, that's the hereafter.
No, I meant the first half of your question. I'll get back when you finish. I'll answer.
Yeah. So, it's a really difficult question to try. It's a long discussion with regards to mercy.
Let me jump in.
Yeah.
Look, it's a tough question to ask because there's no good answer.
That's the thing.
I know, but that's the difficulty. And of course, this is, many of you may know, the Christian tradition and all the monotheistic traditions, when they're committed, this is a famous so-called argument from evil, you'd be familiar with it. And there's no way out of it. This is to talk about logic, as you spoke of before. Yeah. There are contradictory beliefs that you have, that you're committed to, if you think God is omnipotent and omniscient and all benevolent. Because the puzzle is actually insoluble if you believe all three. You've got to drop something. Because when you said there are benevolent...
For us, it's not like that.
Wait. Just let me jump into something you said. When you said you learn a lot of stuff from the tragedies, look, God is meant to be omnipotent. He could have fixed it so you learned it without the bad stuff. There's no, excuse for God. But there's an answer. I know one answer is we don't get it. He's greater than we are, and we don't understand it. That's one answer that's given. And the other answer is free will. That's another answer. Okay, your turn.
So there's this concept in the Quran that is, it's really interesting, because we're talking about cosmological worldviews, and we agree on so much, then where is that? And a lot of the questions we got outside is like, you guys seem to agree on everything. I don't know where is the disagreement.
I know.
And the disagreement is it's this cosmological thing. So when it comes to the Islamic position with regards to what is this world about, generally speaking, why are you here? Not necessarily about meaning and things, but while you're here, what are you to expect out of being in this world? If you read the Quran, it's a place of test and tribulation, and not generally really a good time. That's what you're here for. You're here to look at your reaction to these things, and that's the general test of it. Now you might have a disagreement with that and say, well, but God is merciful, God is this, God is that, and He could fix all of it. So this is where we go into what is your conception of God? And when you have a conception of God that is beyond your demands of Him, beyond your expectations of Him. That's why in the Islamic tradition it's like, does God have to create you? No, He doesn't. Does God need you to worship Him? No, He doesn't. Does God need you to acknowledge Him? No, He doesn't. He's beyond all of this stuff. When you engage in all of these things, you're benefiting yourself. You're not benefiting God in any way. So the Quranic answer to it would be, this world is a place of test and tribulation. And the idea is, let's find out, just like university is a place of test and tribulation, you have professors that professors,
we're not omnipotent.
You are. You have the power to construct an exam that's super easy.
I'm not benevolent either.
What I'm saying is that these things are not absolute in themselves. If you look at the Islamic conception, it's not limited to these things. You have what we arrive at through pure reason with regards to the attributes of God, being free will, all knowledgeable, all these things, existent and necessarily existent, self-sufficient. And then you have attributes that are revealed. And from the attributes of God, you have this, in the Islamic tradition, the 99 names of God. They're divided, there's many different categorizations of them, but the more popular one is the two divisions of Asma'ul Jalal wa Asma'ul Jamal, the names of majesty and the names of beauty. And through the interaction, and if you think about Chinese cosmology, it's the yin and the yang. So you have this aspect of, or the masculine and the feminine. You have the aspect of the giver and the receiver. You have the aspect of the tester and the one who just grants you things. So you have, and through this, the world gets into existence. It's through these things interacting with each other. The world exists through manifestations of the powers of these divine names. Part of it.
This is a bad way out, because this is actually not about God. The question is actually about your belief and what kind
that's
of...
That's my belief about
No, but the question, we could spend the whole next week on this because it's a big topic, but what I just wanted to shift it to, it's asking somebody why you believe three things that are inconsistent. It's not actually about God. It's about you have a belief of a certain kind, and the three things you believe...
The question limits me to three things that I'm not limited to.
Well, anyway, look, the fact is that you have to find an excuse for what are...
Yeah, if I'm limited to it, I have to find an excuse, but I'm not limited to it.
Well,
that's what I'm trying to say.
But that was what I suggested was an answer. You're going to say this is beyond our comprehension.
No. I never said beyond our comprehension. I just said that these three attributes of God are not the only attributes in the Islamic tradition. And when I look in the Quran, looking at tragedy, for example, and what it's about, I have verses that I believe, for example, that as a conclusion of my belief in God and believing in the Prophet and believing, therefore, this is revelation, that this is God telling me things about the world.
But why didn't he tell it to you without causing the suffering? That's the moral difficulty. God is telling you stuff, but he could have stopped the children suffering. The earthquake and God knows what goes on. He's omnipotent. He doesn't have to do it that way. He has a choice.
And he doesn't have to do it your way either.
No, but I'm asking why he did it this way. We deserve an answer.
So that's where you ask. The question actually is about your interaction with these things. It's not about God doing it.
It's my puzzlement. It's a puzzlement about a God that's meant to be benevolent, but he causes suffering.
Your puzzlement presumes a position of equitableness or equality to that. You only make demands of people that are equal to you or beneath you.
It's not a demand. It's a question. It's a puzzlement about a God that has the power to avoid suffering that he creates, and he doesn't have to do it.
So the answer to it, when he says in these verses that he has created life and death for the sake of testing and tribulation. Why?
Why should he test
you? Because he created you and he can do with you whatever he
wants. That's the point, exactly. So why doesn't he test me without the suffering?
It's his choice.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point.
That he's got free will. He can test you however he wants.
Exactly, and that proves...
Just like you can choose whatever question you put in the
You're admitting the premise of the question, admitting he had a choice and he caused suffering.
Peter, that's like me going right now to we had this exam today. I was just, we were just talking about it afterwards. Histology is meant to be in the final exam. It's not meant to come in the midterm. We covered it during the semester. So we can't really go to the School of Medicine and go like, guys, what's up? Histology is meant to be in the final and I didn't really review this as I should. All they're going to come back and say, you should have gone to the tutorials and done the tutorials and done all this stuff. Because you
we're to blame.
So, no, they shift the blame onto the students, right? So it's us. You ask God, who created everything, who decides how everything is supposed to run. He's got ultimate free will by definition, that he's not compelled to do anything. And so through that, you have this life and this world that manifests itself in a way, and in the Quran, it's interesting, the story of how humans got free will, Quranically, is God presented free will to the creation. We have presented the trust, and the trust is understood to be free will, onto the heavens, the mountains, to everything in creation. They refused to take it, and they were actually afraid of it. This thing. But the human being decided to take it. I'll take it, I got this. You know, kind of ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Surely he was oppressive, transgressing, and ignorant, to top it off. To take this free will thing, the idea that I'm going to choose. Now, when you engage in the world, if you're not presented with things you don't like, if everything you're presented with are all things that you like, how do you have free will?
It's a long conversation.
Can I just we've got a similar question that kind of leads into it. To you, Dr. Slezak.
Time!
What defines a human as a human? Animals have a level of thinking and they gain and sleep, etc. But what distinguishes a human from an animal?
It's a biological question with a biological answer. You know, we now have overwhelmingly strong grounds, and maybe one would agree. We evolved from unicellular bugs. And what we have is a picture of what is a human. We have certain, why is a dog different from a monkey? Well, they've got a common ancestor somewhere. We have a common ancestor. The story is not mysterious. There's nothing that science, in a way, doesn't have a fairly complete picture of. And the evolutionary answer is part of it. We branched off a tree at some point. One of the distinctions, which is my central area of interest, actually, in my area of cognitive science, is language. Humans have language which no other organism, no other species have. We've got very, very deep and interesting theories about what it is about the human brain that make us capable of what we're doing now. That's probably a mutation, or at least in any case, it's a development that distinguishes humans from the primates from which we were evolved and most closely related. So, okay, there are answers to that question. They're biological, and they're partly sociological in the sense that human beings, when we've got a society, we develop a culture and a history, and that comes partly, in fact not largely, from our language. Okay, so there are lots of answers to that, but it's not going to be good enough because Mohamed won't agree that that's
interesting. Enough. You call it a mutation. We call it وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا.
Which is?
Sorry. in the Quran, the creation of Adam was followed by, and he taught Adam the names, gave him language, and then asked the angels, what are these things? They couldn't answer because they were questioning God. Why did you create this thing?
Yeah.
And
we've got a better answer now. The answer comes from Chomsky now, not from.
Well, even Chomsky's answer, because it's a language is a puzzle. That
sure.
It's how quickly it developed.
That's right.
And the impact that it has on human culture, society, development, all of that stuff. It's massive. And when I say the Quran has this thing to say about it, I'm not limiting scientific inquiry to it. It's just an interesting thing that we have in the Quran that's like, when you talk about what makes humans different from animals, for example, there's many things that the question comes from the place of, despite the differences between monkeys and dogs, they don't do anything outside of their monkeyness and dogness, if you will. That they're just acting like animals, foraging, doing their thing, eat, drink. In Islamic tradition, one of my teachers, the analogy he gave was, you can live your life as a human being, or you can live your life as cattle. What do cattle do? Cattle get up in the morning, the farmer just gets them out, and they go and graze, and then maybe the female cow finds a nice male cow, and they can make some baby cows. And they just eat some grass and go around and just have the little baby cows around, and they grow up and they go back again at night, and that's their life.
A lot of people do that.
That's what humans do now. What humans do is a sophisticated form of just, let's go and graze, get up in the morning, get in the car, stuck in traffic, go get to work, make the money so that I can go buy things to graze. Instead of going to eat from the grass, I'm going to go to the market, buy it, and come back. Religiously speaking, that is not what your life is supposed to be about. If that's the restriction, that's why in the Quran it says, إِنَّهُمْ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ. If you live your life like that, you're actually worse than cattle, because you have a quality within you, this intellect that you have, that elevates you above. There is no animal that has subjected nature. Human beings have done that. The illusion of subjective nature.
We can agree about all that.
I've got a message, I've got a message, fact check. Animals do have language. Emily Young proved this with a study on dolphins in 2007.
I'm happy to be informed better about what dolphins have, but...
I think the question is what type of... that they have language. Animals do have language in the sense that they communicate with each other through calls and things like that, but that's not the language we're speaking about when we talk about human beings. When we talk about human beings, we're talking about creating new concepts.
Exactly, creativity, which is actually a mathematical property, a recursive mathematical little encoding we've got in our brain.
Can I ask a question? While we're on the topic of the human intellect, it's for myself. I know your background is in neuroscience, and in Islam we have this concept of the fitrah, an innate nature of the human. Where does that tie in terms of belief in God?
So this is a good question actually, because it actually ties in, and people wonder, where do you and Peter disagree? We agree on the fitrah part. The fitrah in Islam is this, God created all human beings with this innate quality within them that they recognize justice when they see it. They recognize oppression when they see it. You don't need a rational argument to show that this action is oppressive. You just know it by gut instinct, if you will, just for lack of a better term. So by gut instinct, by fitrah, by this natural innate inclination, we all share this thing that we all know. We recognize truth, we recognize what is good, we recognize what is pure, we recognize things that are transcendent above us, in a sense, in that way. And so from that, that's why you have societies that can function very well without explicitly saying there is a God. The fitrah is driving that. So where does the fitrah come in now with the intellect and the recognition of God, and where does the fitrah fail? The fitrah is not complete without the intellect completing it and finishing this, what it starts off with. So if you just go by the fitrah, you end up in what is now being increasingly called the age of feeling. I don't know if you've heard this, but a lot of the intellectuals now are starting to call, if the Dark Ages were the age of faith or belief, and the Enlightenment was the age of reason, now we're in the age of feeling. Because now everybody feels some sort of way about whatever you might want to say, and they get offended by some little comment, and so you can't say it anymore. That's the age of feeling. So the fitrah has now gone to a direction where it's not being checked. You need to temper that a little bit. And the fitrah just gets you set up and directs you, and then your intellect will finish the job. Where we disagree is where Peter will not acknowledge where I say that the intellect leads you in this direction. The intellect will lead you towards God is one, will lead you towards a bunch of things that relate to Islamic beliefs. That's where we'll disagree. But where we agree is going to be on a large scale. And that's how you can have humans that have different belief systems live with each other. It's the fitrah that underlies us all. And there's something called universal human attributes. I'm sure you know about it.
No, I agree with that.
I'm trying to find a question to Dr. Slezak, but most of them coming in towards the
Why?
That's right, I'm going to answer his questions anyway, so...
Go ahead.
Yeah. This is a bit of an interesting question. I want to see how you approach this. The question is, why do you believe in Islam?
Why do I believe in Islam? This is it's a hard question to answer in succinct, because it combines many different things. I mean, if you just ask Peter right now, why are you an atheist? I'm sure he's not just going to restrict himself to because science didn't believe it, didn't prove it. There are many things in his life experience that combine together with his rational conclusions.
Let me butt in and give you an answer. Well, the question was, because it's relevant to some things you said earlier. Look, one of it has to do with our personal biographical histories.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is relevant to how you believe, something you mentioned earlier, is about we grow up in a culture, in a religious community, and clearly the beliefs that people have are not evenly distributed across the world. The people in one part of the world believe one thing belongs to a certain religion or a certain national commitment. That tells you something about the nature of the belief, that it's induced, you might say, even the kind of brainwashing. People believe stuff in the community, and the pressure and the way in which the community exerts a lot of subtle and not so subtle pressures to conform. Now, in my case, it's relevant to say that one of the features of my life, which I'm sort of in retrospect a bit pleased about, is I was an outsider to communities. I didn't grow up in a strong... My parents are Jewish, but I wasn't brought up in a religious family. My parents were kind of agnostic or atheists. They never went to the synagogue. So I was left alone. I didn't have any religious indoctrination or upbringing at all. I didn't have any political allegiances. And my view is that when I talk, and I have a lot of political debates with people, and politics and religion are very similar. In fact, if you're interested, I've written an article about it. Anybody wants to it's to do with also the politics of Islamophobia today, where I didn't say when I started, but while I'm free associating for a minute, when I usually am introduced as an atheist, I immediately dissociate myself from Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris, that I think are the most evil people on the planet. They're atheists, but you know the story about them. Yeah. Now, the reason I mention that is because this article I wrote was to do with certain kinds of political beliefs, even among atheists, are driven by irrational, kind of religious, in this case I call it state worship. They have a religion that's an atheist's religion of believing that their state is to be worshipped in a way that's really sick and dangerous. So I think the atheists and non-believers have a lot to answer for morally and politically. But the point I'm making is that the solution, in my view, and the rational approach to belief is, if you're lucky, you don't get indoctrinated into either a religion or a patriotism or a nationalism, and you're kind of just left alone to make up your own mind. And although I'm in a Jewish family, some of you may know that I'm actually fighting with the Jewish community over the Israel-Palestine thing. And I was lucky because I wasn't brought up as a Zionist. And I happen to think, it's not entirely relevant or irrelevant to today, that I think that the position you hold should be decided as if you didn't know where you belong. That's actually John Rawls's principle behind the veil of ignorance. If you didn't know what country you were in, what religion you belonged to, what social class you belonged to, how would you decide what to believe and what to think? That's tough because it's hard. I mean, it's not impossible really for people to answer that question. But the principle, and I was just sort of lucky to be left alone. And one of my Jewish friends, who's a very strict Orthodox believer, once when we were kids, I was about 10, and I said to him, look, the only reason you believe your Jewish faith is you were born in a really ultra-religious Jewish family. And he said to me, but the only reason you're an atheist at the age of 10 or 12 is because I was brought up in an atheist family. I didn't know what the answer to that was. It sounded like a clever answer, but it wasn't. I didn't go to atheist Sunday school. I didn't have to read, Bertrand Russell and Chomsky, and learn it off by heart. He had to learn the faith as religiously educated people are. So I was just left alone. Now, I think that's the trick, but it's not possible in retrospect to decide to dissociate yourself from your upbringing. People can't do it.
There's a couple of things about that. I don't think you can be left alone in the way, to one degree, yeah, I agree you can be to some extent, but as long as you go through an education system, you are being indoctrinated in some.
Sure, you are. You are. Absolutely.
You're receiving a philosophical worldview.
You are, absolutely.
So the way that the education system, at least in the West, is operating, it, by and large, if you are not given religious instruction, where you end up with conflicts and internal dilemmas that bring you into talks like these, you actually will end up as an atheist. That's my position on it, because it's not
my point too.
Yeah, and the reason, so that's to say that you are getting an indoctrination. It's just a different type of indoctrination.
It's not the same.
It's an indoctrination in different kind. It's not explicit. It's not, come and I'll teach you these things. The way that you get delivered the education, go back to the golden age when I talked about Muslim scholars, the way that they interpreted the world. That's why I said you don't go from nature to God, you go from God to nature. The way that Muslims approached it was first go from pure reason, first principles, that God is necessarily existent, that He has free will, all of the different things that you get to. That transcends everything, and the reason you arrive at that conclusion is because I'm going from pure reason. I'm going a priori type of truth.
Well, back to where we started, I never understood any of that. I mean, that didn't make any sense. I mean, we have to go back into that theological dispute. You started off with all this pure reason. That's what we started our discussion.
Okay, so you have two choices. If you want to know what makes an atheist and what makes an theist, you have two choices. You either believe that the universe is eternal, or you believe God is eternal. These are the only two choices.
Believe either of those. You don't have to believe either of those. You have to find out what there's reason to believe.
The reason you have to... No, hold on a second. The reason you have to believe...
You're just the chairman. You say out of it.
Let's get it heated here. Hold on. Hold me back. All right. No. There's only two choices and there's no third. It's either the universe is eternal, because if the universe began at any point to exist, it has come into existence from non-existence. It must have an explanation outside of itself that brought it into existence. Otherwise, you will end up in the circle of fallacy where you say the universe existed before it existed so that it can bring itself into existence after non-existence. I hope that you guys can follow. So that's the first one. Or God is eternal. God is all-powerful. God has free will. God has knowledge because the universe is created not randomly with things that we don't know how to interact with it. And God having these attributes, these necessary... So then that's the interesting thing about the necessary attributes of having eternity, that no beginning, no end, not infinity, eternity, having power, having ability to bring things into existence, having free will, not being compelled. So the position that a lot of atheists hold is the universe has these attributes. God doesn't exist.
Now you're putting words in the mouth of the atheist. Look, as the atheist here, I can tell you what the position is. Whether the universe is eternal or not is a scientific, empirical question for which we have evidence. It used to be thought, because the science wasn't in or the data weren't clear, the steady state. So this is science. There's no point going into this debate here. We don't have to talk about the physics. But you're making out as though there's some...
I'm not making a philosophical question. I'm asking a philosophical question.
You're asking a question. The question has an answer. It's not a question you can answer just a priori or out of nowhere. You have grounds for believing one or another.
If it's eternal, is it eternal? What is the answer to that?
Well, ask the physicist, because they've got an answer to that. And it turns out it's not. It turns out, currently, there's the Big Bang story that it happened at a certain point. There's a big debate about what it came out of, but there was no time before. That's where we can't actually imagine it. But the equations tell us the time and space began. Now, I'm just quoting what the best science is telling you.
You don't need science that say that.
Yes, you
No,
do.
you don't.
See, we disagree about something.
No, you don't. Yeah.
Yes, you do.
You don't need science to tell you that the universe began.
Because the Quran and the Bible told you.
No. Without the Quran and the Bible.
So
Forget all that.
how do
Let's
you know?
just pretend like we're just...
How come everybody
We're nothing.
believed that it
We're
didn't
nothing.
have a beginning?
We are nothing. We are not atheists. We are not Muslim. We are not...
So
we're
how do
just
you know
totally
which is
starting
which is
off.
which? How do you know which is which? By pure thought.
Yeah.
That's what you tell me.
Yes.
It's not good enough.
How?
You
It's
can't
not,
just make up
no,
stuff.
you don't just say it's not good enough. You ask how. How is it done through pure thought? How do you know that the universe began?
You
Just
tell
through
me.
pure thought. Because it changes.
What changes?
The universe changes. It's in a constant state of change. If it was
Right.
eternal,
And that's what science tells us.
without science, just through experience,
Where do you get things that don't come from science?
just ask this conclusion before scientists said it. Scholars from the Christian tradition, Catholics,
Sure, they
they've
said
all
all this
said the
stuff.
same thing. They've said the same thing. They've all come to the conclusion
You
that
can
the
find everything you want in
yeah, I know,
ancient texts.
But you're saying that it's confirmed by science, therefore it's true.
Not confirmed.
Well,
They've discovered something that
No,
turns
it's
out
not-
people see it.
No. People have said it. They've recognized it in the world. They've recognized that the world is always in a constant state of change. People are born, they grow up, they get old, they die, and it goes on. Trees get planted as seeds,
So?
they come up. So there's always this constant state of change.
What
You
there's
have
reason to
The
believe.
reason you have to... No, hold on a second. The reason you have to...
And you're just the chairman. You say out of it.
Let's get it heated here. Hold me back. All right. No, there's only two choices and there's no third. It's either the universe is eternal, because if the universe began at any point began to exist, it has come into existence from non-existence. It must have an explanation outside of itself that brought it into existence. Otherwise, you will end up in the circle of fallacy where you say the universe existed before it existed so that it can bring itself into existence after non-existence. I hope that you guys can follow. So that's the first one. Or God is eternal. God is all-powerful. God has free will. God has knowledge because the universe is created not randomly with things that we don't know how to interact with it. And God having these attributes, these necessary... So then that's the interesting thing about the necessary attributes of having eternity, that no beginning, no end, not infinity, eternity, having power, having ability to bring things into existence, having free will, not being compelled. So the position that a lot of atheists hold is the universe has these attributes. God doesn't exist.
Now you're putting words in the mouth of the atheist. Look, as the atheist here, I can tell you what the position is. Whether the universe is eternal or not is a scientific, empirical question for which we have evidence. It used to be thought, because the science wasn't in or the data weren't clear, the steady state. So this is science. There's no point going into this debate because we don't have to talk about the physics. But you're making out as though there's some...
I'm not making a philosophical question. I'm asking a philosophical
You're asking a question. The question has an answer. It's not a question you can answer just a priori or out of nowhere. You have grounds for believing one or another.
If it's eternal, is it eternal? What is the answer to that?
Well, ask the physicist, because they've got an answer to that. And it turns out it's not. It turns out, currently, there's the Big Bang story that it happened at a certain point. There's a big debate about what it came out of, but there was no time before. That's where we can't actually imagine it. But the equations tell us that time and space began. Now, I'm just quoting what the best science is telling you.
You don't need science that say that.
Yes, you
No,
do.
you don't.
See, we disagree about something.
No, you don't. Yeah.
Yes, you do.
You don't need science to tell you that the universe began.
Because the Quran and the Bible told you.
No. Without the Quran and the Bible.
So
Forget all that.
how do you
Let's
know?
just pretend like we're just...
How come everybody believed that it didn't have a beginning?
We are nothing. We are not atheists. We are not Muslim.
Okay.
We are not...
So
we're
how do
just
you know
totally
which is
starting
which is
off.
which? How do you know which is which? By pure thought.
Yeah.
That's what you tell me.
Yes.
It's not good enough.
How?
You can't just make up stuff.
You don't just say it's not good enough. You ask how. How is it done through pure thought? How do you know that the universe began? Just
tell
through
me.
pure thought. Because it changes.
What changes?
The universe changes. It's in a constant state of change. If it was
Right.
eternal,
And that's what science tells us.
without science, just through experience,
Where do you get things that don't come from science?
just ask this conclusion before scientists said it. Scholars from the Christian tradition, Catholics,
Sure, they
they've
said
all
all this
said the
stuff.
same thing. They've said the same thing. They've all come to the conclusion
You
that
can find everything you want in ancient texts.
But you're saying that it's confirmed by science, therefore it's true.
Not confirmed.
Well,
They've discovered something that
No,
turns
it's
out
not-
people see.
No. People have said it. They've recognized it in the world. They've recognized that the world is always in a constant state of change. People are born, they grow up, they get old, they die, and it goes on. Trees get planted as seeds, they come up. So there's always this constant state of change. Okay. With a constant state of change, when you have something having a constant state of change, it implies from that it is not eternal. It had to begin, because it came into existence at some point.
Yeah, but you see, you're using rational...
Is that a valid rational logical thinking?
It might be, but that's not the point.
Okay, no, it is the point. No, let me just push it further a little bit, Peter. So if that's the case, if the universe, rationally, logically speaking, it started at some point, and I haven't appealed to any scientific authority at this point. I've just simply stated self-evident facts that everybody experiences. So we got to a point where the universe has begun. If it's begun, you have to come up with an explanation for its beginning.
Maybe it didn't begin. Look, until the whole story of the modern physics, actually the leading, most widely accepted theory was that it was eternal. The steady state theory was the universe is just here and it was always here. That was a plausible theory.
That takes me back to the original position of either you believe the universe is eternal or you believe God is eternal.
It's not a question of just what you believe, it's a question of what there's evidence for.
No.
You don't make choices just without any ground.
No, you started off with a position and then you investigated the evidence, right? That's what scientists did. They started off with the position of the universe is eternal.
That seemed to be the plausible story. There was no evidence to the contrary.
It just seemed that way, and then they investigated and came up, wait a minute.
Well, they found out some amazing things.
Yeah, it's great. But it started at some point. The question that most people would ask afterwards is, how did it come about? You will propose, not you personally, but you can either propose something that has no scientific evidence whatsoever. There's no way for us to ever actually figure it out. Multiverse, because you want to push the puck further back. You know this God of the Gap business? Let's push the puck further a little bit. Come up with another theory so that we can assert that this material realm exists eternally somehow. Because at the end of the day, it seems to me, it's an interesting cognitive phenomenon. Human beings, by nature, need something eternal. It's either the universe or it's God. Everything that, you want to go with science, everything the scientists are telling us right now that is verifiable it's not the universe. Therefore, the logical, rational question, which you conceded just 2 seconds ago, it might be valid, that it started, so you got to ask yourself, what started?
Why is that so unpersuasive to somebody like me, or anybody else who doesn't already believe what you believe? You're setting out something which ought to be persuasive, and it's just not.
That's an empirical claim that needs evidence now.
From an empirical perspective, do you consider it necessary to figure out where the world came from?
Not necessary. It's an interesting question, and we've got a lot of things to say about it now that we didn't used to have. I mean, look, I keep just going around in circles here. It's an extraordinary fact that the science of Big Bang cosmology, the stages in that, you've got to pick up one of the popular science books by Gribben or somebody to read. You know, the background microwave radiation, how they discovered that. If you know this story, it's extraordinary. The recession, the redshift in the galaxies, it's the most amazing and really shocking discovery that there was a moment in time before there was nothing and not even time. Now, that's just what the equations tell you. Mm-hmm. Now, when I use English sentences, it doesn't make any sense, but that's in a way the excitement and the intellectual inspiration that we can find out such extraordinary things.
Disagree. I think it makes perfect sense.
Well,
I can understand the idea. I may not be able to imagine it in a way because I don't have experience with it.
You can't have experience of these equations. This is
that's what I'm saying. I don't have experience of it, but I can understand it. When you say a place before time, the universe began before that there was no time. There was no space even.
You can imagine that?
I can understand it. I can't imagine it. I can understand that English sentence. It makes sense. It's not nonsensical. It makes sense.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say.
But it's reporting something in ordinary English, which is a mathematical...
Yes. So I accept all of that stuff, and I understand it, even though I can't imagine it, because I don't have the relevant background of experience to have the imagination for it. Okay. So when we get to that, that's why when you say, how do you approach, why are you a Muslim? When I get to these things, I look at the different religions. Which religion tells me, before I looked into the religions, which religion is the one that says God is one, omnipotent, free-willing, eternal, there is no parts to him, There's none of that. If you look at the different, you can narrow it down. Judaism says that. Islam says that. All right.
Polytheistic. There's lots of religions.
Polytheists don't say that. Polytheists, if you push, for example, the Hindu tradition all the way to the top, they will tell you there is this ultimate reality. From there you get these 3 million gods or whatever. But I want like a simple, and the other thing is it has to be accessible to everybody. Because if you want to talk about God's mercy, and you want to restrict it by saying only brilliant scientists can discover him, for the rest of us to, we're waiting on the upper echelon of scientific community to come and tell us, guys, we figured it out, because these are now our priests and rabbis. No, it needs to be accessible to everybody. I need to have an argument that is simple enough that a Bedouin in Arabia and somebody in Russia and somebody in Louisiana and somebody in Australia, all of them can agree that this makes sense and I can comprehend.
But how can you legislate that the truth should be understandable by the Bedouin and
No, it has to be simple enough. If it's something that is applicable to everybody,
why should it be? Some things are not that simple.
If the claim is belief for everyone, that's the religious claim.
Yeah, but that's what I'm asking. How do you justify that? Some things are not that simple.
I'm not justifying. I'm just saying if the religious person is claiming that everybody needs to be a Muslim, for example, to be saved. That's the Muslim position, right? To go to heaven, you need to be a Muslim. All right. Your belief has to be simple enough and not complicated that it goes beyond some people. Because if it goes beyond some people, then you've restricted God's mercy somehow. It has to be simple enough. So if you go, the simplest conclusion you can get is through pure reason deduction, which gets you to God is one, omnipotent, free-willing, has knowledge, the different 7 attributes that you can derive. And from that, then you investigate. All right, so now I have a bunch of people claiming to be prophets. And there are plenty of them. Some were charlatans, some were just schizotype, some were whatever. So how do I figure out which one is right, which one is true? Now you have to investigate historically, just get into a bit of a biography, digging into like, all right, to whatever degree you can arrive at that truth of it somehow. You look in the Islamic tradition, that's why like judging these things simply just through the way that you arrive at truth, even in science. If I did one experiment and I said, this is the conclusion, therefore I have solved the problem, the paper will get rejected. They want at least 4 different experiments that target the question differently, using different methods, and then I can propose my idea at the end, and if it's consistent and it's mathematically validated, then they accept the paper. That's how it works. So the same thing with the argument with regards to God. You have to come at it from different angles. You can't just say this is the one argument that be all or end all. Alright, so I've come up with the God. What about the prophets? I look, for example, about Mormonism. Why am I not a Mormon? You got this Joseph Smith who claims to be, this and that, and Israelites in the native population and whatnot. Why am I not accepting him? Is because when I look at his biography, which is very recent, the guy was known to be a charlatan, he was known to be a liar, he was known to be an opportunist, there's so many things that are available on record.
You think the historical evidence of the prophets?
When it comes, the historical evidence, the reason you believe scientists, for example, is because of like a diffuse congruence, like you have all of these people coming to a conclusion about it. I've never been to Timbuktu. Why do I believe Timbuktu exists? Is because there's so many different reports from so many different people that say this exists. So if I have, for example, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which by the way, if you look into the relevant academics who study the biography of the Prophet and study the Quran, they all, even non-Muslims by the way, they all agree that what we know about the Prophet, this is it. This is not just some made up stuff. And what we know about the Quran, this is the Quran as he recited the Quran. This is not a different Quran. Forget about do you believe it's from God or not. At least I know that these documents are exactly as they are. So I look at his biography. His own enemies, his own detractors, his own propaganda against him, they all said all kinds of stuff. But the one thing they never accused him of was lying. Or being insane. So look at his biography.
Look, there are a lot of biographies, and that's... let me ask you, for example, about the Christian tradition, where the Christians tell me exactly the same story.
About Jesus Christ and the crucifixion.
They also have, I've had this debate with leading theologians, Christian theologians, and they will run, I'm thinking of one in particular that I've debated with a couple of times, you may even know William Lane Craig. Yeah. He's one of the leading Christian theologians, and he will argue, for example, if you, excuse me for me to elaborate this example, because it's parallel to yours. Yeah. And he's a very sophisticated guy. I mean, he really knows his stuff about the physics and certainly the scholarship and the historical testimonies of Jesus. So he will tell me that the argument for the resurrection of Jesus and the reason that Jesus is God and is there, inspiration is because of the historical evidence of the resurrection, and he will go into all the detail about the evidence that is for the resurrection.
I'll tell you why I reject him.
Well, but I'm offering his, or the authoritative historical texts like you're offering.
Yeah, it's not the authoritative. There's a debate.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's the
There's
thing.
a lot of debate.
There's a lot of debate about
In fact, it's all very doubtful.
Yes, so just because it's doubtful, now I have questions. I don't know anymore.
Exactly. But you think that your textual historical evidence is more reliable
talk
than
about
that
the person of the Prophet Muhammad, for example, as a person, his biography, that is not up to debate with regards to his character, with regards to his mental stability.
But you only have certain kinds of textual or historical evidence. There's nothing about that has to be correct. It may be consistent.
I'm not saying that it has to. I'm saying that when you have numerous figures
it's
in
consistent.
different places all consistently saying the same thing about him, especially his own detractors reporting the same thing,
Sure.
Now I have to question things. And I have to say, all right, so he's making this claim that he's a messenger of God, and he's coming with this message from, all right, what is this message? If I already accepted through my rational deductions that God has to exist and all the qualities of God, then I accept, all right, I'm going to entertain you for a second. You claim to be a messenger of God?
But which is first? You accepted God first, and then you accept he's the messenger of God?
First God.
First God. But where did that come from?
The rational deductions that we went through.
So you started with you accepted God, and then you
accepted
evidence that Muhammad was the messenger.
I started with that, and then there are necessary attributes of messengers. So for me, rationally arrived at necessary attributes of messengers. What are they? This person cannot be insane. There has to be zero reports of this person having lost their wits by unanimous consensus.
And you can be certain about that too?
Yes, I can be.
Well, I don't accept that.
You might not, but academics in the field who study this.
No, but it's not possible. It's not look.
It is possible.
It's a historical case for which we don't have direct evidence.
We have enough evidence from various figures by the thousands that all agree on this. That he has not lost his mind. He has never lied to anybody. He has never cheated anybody.
That's the evidence. I accept
He has
evidence.
So these are the things that we look for with regards to messengers. All right, so he's never done any of these things. So now I have to ask, what is he claiming? What is he asking me to do?
He could be sincere. I don't doubt his sincerity.
Sincere. Again, even Christian apologists, Christians who don't like Islam, say he was Dante. He put him in I can't remember which level of hell because he said he was sincere about it. So, again, same thing. They don't doubt that stuff. So even his own, when I look at people that are non-Muslim, confirming positive things that I rationally require of somebody who claims to be a messenger, then I look into the claims. What is he asking me to do? What is he asking me to believe? He's asking me to believe in the thing that I rationally arrived at already, that I recognize.
It's a circular system you've got.
Hold on. So he's asking me to do that. What else is he asking me to do? He's asking me to adopt injunctions, religious injunctions that are there to better my life. Well, how am I going to judge that this is going to better my life? That's where Imam Ghazali says, the only way for you to do it is to actually do it. You have to engage in the practice of doing it. And it's like me trying to explain to you all of the different chemical structures of honey and chocolate and how it's put together, and then claiming that I know how it tastes like. You have to taste the chocolate. So when it comes to Islam, not to compare it to chocolate, but you actually have to engage in the practice. You have to do the thing. And that's why you see all these stories of people going to like the Himalayas and doing all these practices. For us, for Muslims, we're like, you're engaged in a bit of some of the practices that Muslims would say, that's fine, you're getting engaged in that. You're experiencing the physical effect of it, but you're not on the spiritual straight path when it comes to that. Because it's not consistent with your intellectual, your spiritual is not being consistent with your intellectual. So you ask me, why am I a Muslim? It's because my intellectual requirements for a religious belief are being just as satisfied as my spiritual requirements of my practice of Islam.
I better let another question come up.
You can keep going with this.
I want to take a question from the floor.
Yes. Just to simplify a little bit, I wanted to take you a little bit through sort of my journey and
how long have we got? How long is the journey?
very, very quick. So I come from a background in a very good place, and my father was raised Catholic and my mom's Muslim, and
You're a mixed up kid.
Yes, and I do see where you're coming from with using logic to understand the creative process and find divinity through that. And I really wanted to find out, based on first principles, we come from a cell that was placed here. So cell theory, I wanted to find out a little bit more on your understanding of where this first cell came from, and perhaps if it was given by some other power.
Look, there's a really simple answer to the question. Firstly, it's not from first principles. Nothing in science is from first principles. It's all fallible, and in some way, according to philosophers like Quine and others, there's no foundation. Foundationalism is now not a proper way to understand science. Everything is negotiable. Now, if you're just asking biology, just pick up a biology textbook. That's the short answer. Because it'll have a very rich, very complete answer. Now, it's a historical question because we don't actually know what the actual first source of life was. But you know what we know now? We know the chemistry down to the atomic, well, we know that. Life is now a matter of chemistry. And there's no mystery in the ultimate sense of they used to think life had a life force, and because we didn't understand the chemistry. Now we've got everything down to the atomic level. The mystery is the complexity and the history, so it's not like we understand everything, but the short answer to you is basically physics and chemistry. And we're a product of that. And they're now creating synthetic reproductive chemicals, DNA-like structures. We know enough about it to be able to, it's a bit scary, frankly. We know too much for our own good. As you were saying before, when Mohamed was saying about the way the world is going, we're basically screwing the world up because we're so powerful with our knowledge. But anyway, the answer to your question is, pick up a good biology textbook. That's it. You ask whether there's something else. You wanted to bring something else that created the first thing.
No, we can definitely make all the DNA, we can make the RNA, we can make the enzymes, but we can't quite transition it from loose atoms, loose enzymes into a whole function cell.
We don't know everything yet, so yeah.
If there's some sort of force that may have helped.
Why make up a force?
So, okay, I think that what we can, Craig Venter, the first synthetic life. So he made the cell with like the minimal genetic makeup that you need, and so he made that stuff. I think your question lies more into the teleology of all of it. Like it just seems like everything seems to be directed towards a teleological end. I mean, this cell that Craig Venter put out, Craig Venter had to use his intellect to put together a cell and put everything together in a way and to figure out like this is enough for it to have a living cell that can replicate. So the question, I think, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it goes along that line. Like, in neuroscience, for example, when I study synaptic plasticity, it's sodium going in, glutamate binding, sodium going in, potassium coming out, all these different things. But at the end of the day, it's sodium ions and potassium ions. Like, where's the intellect in that?
So we're on the same side again.
So, okay, but these things are quantities, they're not qualities. They're just things that are happening across, and I can construct a nerve, I can do all of that stuff, I can create the perfect environment for it, but I don't have intellect from there. I just have neurons firing with sodium.
If you've got enough neurons, you have intellect. You have to have 10,000 million neurons, and then you've got an intellect. That's all.
Necessarily, the elephant has a larger brain than
It hasn't got an intellect? Sure it has.
It doesn't have the human intellect.
Well, of course, because it's got a different brain.
Yeah.
But it's not mysterious.
But no, what I'm saying is that it has the same stuff to work with.
Sure, so does a mouse.
Yeah, and yet they don't become intelligent people having a discussion about does God exist.
Give it another few million years and it'll evolve into us.
We just touched on the origin of life. How about the end of life? Dr. Slezak, do you believe in the concept of death?
I believe in death. I don't believe there's anything after it. Of course I believe in death. Do I believe in it? Listen, it's no longer fashionable, but Woody Allen, who watches Woody Allen movies? I don't know if you need to bother. He's got the answer to all these questions, You don't know Woody Allen movies, you missed the point. I mean, I got to tell you, these views give me the shits. I don't like any of it. This nothingness, it's like the typical philosophical puzzle. But it's a kind of modesty and a humility. I can't escape what appear to be the truths about the world. And one of the virtues, I think, of intellectual life is to accept views that appear to be true as best you can understand it. And my hero in this, by the way, is I haven't mentioned him yet tonight. I don't mean Chomsky, I mean Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was a great mathematician and philosopher, and he has a very famous essay called one's called What I Believe, another one's called A Free Man's Worship. And the Free Man's Worship is the story of how you confront these big questions of death and the apparent meaninglessness of the world. That's an atheist's answer to these big questions. And I share all that. I read him when I was 16, if you want to know. And I couldn't find better answers than he gives.
So a free man's worship in the Islamic tradition, there's three types of worship. A slave's worship, a merchant's worship, and a free man's worship.
And which one have I got?
The slave's worship is you worship God because you're afraid of God's punishment if you don't. A merchant's worship is you worship God because you want to get into heaven. A free man's worship is you worship God because God is deserving of that worship, regardless of the consequences.
What about the other one? The free man's worship that rejects all of them for all reasons.
So
Which
that type of one is going to be, can you please bring me back so that I can... The Quranic position on that is, can you please bring me back? Because that free man is going to say, can you please take me back so that I can redo this a little bit.
Right. There's a bunch of questions, very urgent ones at the back. I don't know if you want to take some of those.
Yeah.
What's your plan?
Gonna wrap up really soon because
We
we're
literally just wanted to ask, like, what about the mere possibility that there is no afterlife? So what if you, does not scare you?
Does it scare me?
Like, not scare, but like, do you ever have that doubt that, you know, there is something behind, like us humans, like you base your life believing on, you know, things based on, you said to the guy, pull up a biology textbook. Textbooks are written by people just like us. Where's the intellect behind cell science? It's all like it's so amazing, it's so beyond us. Where's it? Don't you think there's a greater entity behind everything that we see around us here living now? Like after
You mean like the Vice Chancellor?
No, like do you ever have that doubt that like there might be something after you die? How are you sure that there's nothing?
I've got lots of doubts. I wish I was wrong. It'd be really nice to end up somewhere else after. Mind you, I don't like that either. I mean, the whole idea is awful. You know, I can't win this because, you know, eternity is a pretty scary idea. And not existing for eternity is equally scary. Look, we shouldn't even talk about this stuff. It's too horrible. We should just go to the movies or go out tonight to the nightclub or do something, you know.
That's why people are atheists, right? That's what I'm trying to say. The religion, the beautiful words of Islam and things, that the religion gives you an answer. Why?
Yeah, but it's a bad answer. What are you trying to tell me, to believe something that is not plausible? That's not a good reason to believe anything. Look, Bertrand Russell is wonderful in this. He says something like, firstly, happiness is no less real happiness because it comes to an end. And he says, although you look out, he gives a metaphor of looking out of a window where it's cold outside, there's also a somber and austere beauty to the universe that you can appreciate intellectually. But he's trying to confront the questions we all have. And I, as a 16-year-old, admired that. It was a sort of a courageous and humble confrontation with our mortality and allowing your rational beliefs to be driven by what best reason. In fact, his question, someone asked him a famous anecdote, what would happen, I think your question, if you find yourself in heaven afterwards? You find yourself up there, and what would he say to God when he gets up there? And why were you an atheist? Why didn't you believe? He says, sorry God, there just wasn't enough evidence. You know, that was a fair answer. The problem with a lot of religions, it's very interesting when I have debates with the Christians often, and maybe with Islam as well, that we are supposed to get punished. We're not going to go to heaven just for being skeptical. And the Christians in particular have what I think is an awful view, that they're all going to go to heaven and I get punished just because I'm skeptical. That's kind of not fair. I mean, maybe God isn't such a nice guy after all, you know, because a lot of people, in all honesty...
So the Islamic position on non-Muslims, by the way, for the unaware, is it's not... We cannot say any specific person is going into hell. We don't know, because I don't know if I'm going to heaven either. I could be a total hypocrite. I don't know. There's something that I always question myself. With regards to non-Muslims, being skeptical and being in search is actually an honored thing. That you are in search of things. You're trying to find out. The problem in Islam with if you read in the Quran, the punishment for a non-Muslim is always linked with a type of an intellectual arrogance that rejects truth after it's become manifest to such a degree that you're like, I don't know. I don't want this at all. So that's the thing. But you can't say it's person X, X, Y, and Z. These people are going definitely. You can't say that. Whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim either, we don't know. Very few people like Pharaoh, few people are mentioned by name in the tradition that these people are definite. Abu Lahab, very few people are mentioned by name, and it's because of things that they had done and acted in ways that you would be like, if I told you Hitler's going to hell, you'd be like, all right, good riddance. I'm not going to be upset about Hitler going to hell. But that's another deep discussion about that.
I've got about 30 more questions I want to go through, but we don't have time.
Yeah.
It's getting to 9 p.m., which is what we're meant to wrap up. I'm going to give it a chance. Do you guys want to have a final concluding statement each? Yeah, so
I prefer to take a question rather than. I mean, you may want to say something more, but we've had a good say.
Yeah, we could take some questions.
I've got a quick one about that intellectual arrogance.
Yeah.
If I am not to believe in your God, even though it's been made so apparent to me, what is intellectually arrogant about that? I'll relate it to, if you can't convince me that 1 + 1 = 2, how is that intellectually arrogant of me? Isn't that kind of more incompetence in a way?
Yeah, that's incompetence. That's different. But intellectual arrogance is when So for example, the first sin in Islam is not eating from the tree. The first sin was when God created Adam, He instructed all the angels to bow down in prostration to Adam. One decided, I don't think so. And that was what's termed Lucifer, Satan, whatever. He said, I'm not going to do that. And God asked him, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you do what I commanded? And Satan said, because I'm better than him. You created him from clay, from dust, from dirt, from the earth, and you created me from fire, from smokeless fire. I'm a higher being than him. I'm not going to prostrate to him. So that's the intellectual arrogance I'm talking about. Satan is literally talking to God, and who created him. And God is saying, do this, and he says, no, I won't. And why? It's because I'm better than this thing that you created. This is intellectual arrogance. You know truth, you see it so manifest in front of you, and you decide, I'm not going to do it. So, the thing with Islam that's difficult nowadays, and I'm not suggesting any non-Muslim is not Muslim because of this, but the thing with Islam, it's an unpopular club. For you to be a Muslim and be identified as a Muslim and walk around and say these things, you have to deal with the emotional. That's like when you're investigating any religion, Islam, Christianity. Christians can be ridiculed too. Any religion that you're investigating, the first thing before you investigate it is deal with the emotional issues that you might have regarding, if I'm convinced by this, I'm going to go along with it, regardless of what it means to my social life. Ask a lot of converts to Islam. You're talking about families getting broken up. You're talking about people getting disowned by their parents, losing their friends, losing their networks. Like a lot of issues that go along with that. And so there is this trauma that's about to happen. And so you have people that will come up with excuses, things to come up with to say, like, I'm not going to get into this. Unless you identify these things and know for sure that no matter what, I'm going to go along with whatever truth happens to be. Like right now, if you happen to have a tyrannical government come up and you decide, no, we're not going to take it and we're going to speak against it regardless of the consequences of that, you've made that decision and then you go and speak up. Otherwise, if you're not aware of these things that are working within you, because a human being is not just a automaton, computerized thing that's going around just, deciphering logic and mathematics and just calculating things. There's a lot of issues that go along with what you make a decision about. So, yeah, there's a difference between incompetence, 1 + 1 = 2 all the time. And if you don't want to accept that, I'm just going to treat you as a nut job. I'm not going to say you're intellectually arrogant. But if I tell you something, like an example, anti-vaccination crowds. I hope that I'm hopefully not offending anybody here. But those individuals, you can present them with all types of evidence about this stuff. You can show them, like, I show you the sun, and then you say, no, I'm not seeing it. All right, you are an intellectually arrogant in something. So that's it, you know what I mean? So if I present you all these different things and you don't find the conclusion plausible, valid, this is where it's going to lead me, then I have to go and run with it.
But how do you decide, like,
I don't decide,
you decide. Where it crosses that threshold of...
That's not for me to decide.
Let me jump in down. What you're saying is very important, but it's also very political. If you go into politics, the problem of confronting people with what is overwhelming evidence and their refusal to accept it, I'm struggling with this a lot in my own political life. Now, it's partisan and obviously not a neutral thing to say because the other side thinks equally I'm arrogant for not accepting what they think is the truth. There's no simple answer to that question.
No.
And your point about people paying a high emotional price for joining Islam, people who dissent from their community equally pay a high price because they become pariahs. And the moment you're a political dissident, for example, not just religiously, but let's say you decide that your group is, let's say, committing terrible crimes, people pay a high price for that. And the way of keeping people loyal is the huge psychological pressures on conformity and obedience.
Yeah.
And so to become a dissident is also an act of kind of intellectual courage.
Yeah.
So these are not simple questions at all. It's not just about religion.
No, yeah, and just a final point about the religious thing. It's very emphatically stated, so clear in the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. It is not for me to impose it on anybody or make sure that you become, and if you don't, then I have to do something to you. Nothing like that. No compulsion in religion, and then it follows that by saying the truth and falsehood have been discerned from each other, and people can make their own minds up and their decisions about what they want. And that's why God gave everybody free will. It's not for me to take it away from you and impose anything upon you. And I'm not going to judge you, because the thing is, I don't know what your background is, man. I don't know, what you don't know, what you got going on in your life. I don't. So for me to even make that judgment that I've shown you the truth, therefore you're intellectually arrogant, I don't know.
I think more what I was getting at, not that you are judging me, but more that
Abstractly
if
speaking?
abstractly judgment is being passed, what is wrong with being too skeptical, right? If you can't be convinced, it's not arrogance, it's that you're being extremely skeptical and that it's just not in your face.
That's just as a personal kind of just a thing. Be skeptical about your own skepticism sometimes. Sometimes, it's like this American proverb, what does it say? You can be so open-minded that you can have your brains fall out. Some things you have to so you're very sure of your skepticism. I would question that assurity that you have about your skepticism. And so that's what you have to ask yourself. Is everything, and that's what Descartes got engaged in, and that's which he, by the way, plagiarized Ghazali for. So that's why, that book, for example, Deliverance from Error, it's short, it's not long, and it's really easy read, and he wrote it for the masses. Ghazali, Deliverance from Error, because he actually talks exactly about that. What if I'm being too skeptical, or am I allowed to be this skeptical? What is the degree of skepticism that I should go to? And at what point does my skepticism become kind of or circular arguments?
And the skepticism is exactly what the global warming deniers pretend that they rely on.
Exactly. So that's
they
an
think
example.
That they're the great intellectual skeptics and they're rejecting everything for which a rational person would be persuaded by.
Exactly.
So being a skeptic can be
it can be a double-edged sword.
An arrogant kind of
Yes.
Yes.
Some people leave you around dragon too long. Any pressing questions?
Yeah.
Short questions with short answers.
Yep. So basically, we talked about pain and suffering, right? So to you, there's an Islamic quote, and it goes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear, right?
Say that again, sorry.
So Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. So saying that, can I not bear the same pains that a person, say, like a Rohingya is currently going through? So ultimately, is it just my choice to overcome a certain pain and adapt to it? Or can everybody adapt to it? Does that make sense?
No, not a lot. It's a longer conversation. It's an interesting question, but I'm not sure how to tease that out. You're asking about the pain that's involved in what?
Say anything, day-to-day things.
Well, look, people have different kinds of pain. I mean, look, the world is a mess, and I've got a very active political life, and if you care about the world at all, there's an enormous amount of unnecessary pain and suffering that people inflict on one another. And it's partly based on biases and prejudices and unwillingness to look at the evidence and all sorts of other things. So, look, we're probably very privileged in this audience here. We're living well, relatively.
Really privileged.
Yeah, and we can afford to debate about whether the world began or didn't begin. Most people in the world actually don't have the luxury for this. And so, I don't know how to answer your question. I think being sensitive to a lot of pain in the world is a very healthy, important thing for us to do, because then maybe we can do something about it. And that's not about religion, it's just about being, from any faith, having the kind of principles that Muhammad was saying are common to Islam, to every decent religion.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a good answer, but pain is too common. And
We're going to take final question. Just at the front. Final question.
Okay. So we covered John Rawls. I covered it's in the philosophy of human rights that we did last year at uni. So with these ideas of public reason or veil of ignorance, it comes across as a liberal tool to feign neutrality. So you see that there's a built-in assumption. So an assumption that you can identify human nature outside of our own lived experiences, or that we're not genetically pre-programmed in a particular way. So given the fact that those two assumptions are questionable to begin with, how then can moral objectivity come out of human subjectivity?
Which two assumptions?
The assumptions that you can sort of view, like, because the veil of ignorance is to suggest that imagine you're not already in a position in society and you're going to a society where you may be sort of there's like a lottery and you might be in any position, so you form a society that would be most cohesive to, even if you got some bad position in that society. So I guess it assumes that you're not already in a position, or it assumes that your own experiences thus far in your life have not tainted that idea, assuming that genetically you're not already predisposition to a particular view.
I touched on it before. Let me repeat the question if I understand it. Look, you're asking how's it possible to adopt this higher, neutral position to look at your beliefs and come up with what are objectively, morally and in other ways, the most appropriate, let's say, social arrangements. Look, it's an ideal, and we're fallible, and part of it has to do with the kind of discussion we're having today. People debate and argue. There's no really good answer there, because, again, if you're not a foundationalist, you don't think there's some bedrock of secure knowledge in morals or in science, it's partly through the dialectic of discussion, and you debate with people, so you come up, and not everybody agrees with rules. It's not my own specialty. But as I said, I think the principle of making the effort to transcend your own allegiances, your own cultural, ethnic and religious belongings. You know who's my great hero who speaks like this very eloquently? Is the Palestinian Ibn Said. Ibn Said, he wrote beautifully about how everybody has a culture and a religion and a belonging, and we care about these things. As a Palestinian American, he grew up in a certain environment, but he says, a very famous lecture, the Reith Lectures in London in 1994, where I often quote where he says that we all have our community suffering, to go back to your question of pain, but the important thing is to generalize from that, from your suffering and your group suffering to others. So in other words, with the power of our intellect and our goodwill, we can transcend our own personal circumstances to sympathize with another group and to understand their motives and their pains. Now that's a human effort that we can all make, after all. So it's a version of rules that you try to abstract yourself or distance yourself from your own historically contingent commitments to a religion or to a culture or to a political class or to a political interest. Now, it's not that impossible, after all. The great thinkers, and I take Edward Said to be one of those, argues for what is ultimately a moral and decent way to go about making decisions about what your allegiances are. And in a sense, that comes back to the religion, but it's more than that. It's a question of how you live your life as a decent person. So I think that's a kind of an answer. It's a version of rules that it goes back to asking questions and facing skeptically. I mean, the skepticism that's a virtue, applied to your own deepest commitments, your own unchallenged allegiances. Now, it's very hard to do because we all grow up with these instincts to wave the flag, and we're encouraged to. Our society doesn't encourage skeptical, critical thinking, because then you're going to be an outcast. And you know, you mentioned the consequences quite rightly. There's nothing as uncomfortable as being treated like a ratbag by your community. You're an outcast. I've seen this happen to people, as you were mentioning too, for various reasons. That takes a lot of intellectual and moral courage to be able to do that. And so the heroes that I admire are the ones that think independently. And we may not agree on things, but in the end, you're part of a common humanity, and you have to recognise that. I don't know why that's so hard for people. There's something really bothers me about that. The shared humanity that Edward Said is advocating, you think that doesn't have to be argued for. And it seems to be we have to keep learning that and trying to propagate that message.
And just to take off from that final point. Okay, so just to take off from that, for Muslims, generally speaking, the tradition is filled with scholars engaging in these discussions in that type of way, where I'm uncomfortable with the notion of using religion, and just the way that the questions sometimes get phrased. I notice, not just here, but everywhere. The position of having this, we use the term objective as if you want to make it an injunction upon everybody that you need to behave in this way, otherwise you're not living right. And it makes people who are, not religious nervous, because you're imposing something now that you think this is the objective truth, when in fact you're just imposing your religion onto me now in some way. And if you look at, again, I'll go back to Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who I quoted earlier about the wisdom and justice and all of that. He's got a very long text talking about rulings for non-Muslims living in Muslim lands. What do we do with them? And he goes at length at just ensuring that, let people do their own thing, let people live however they see fit, however they see right, so long as it doesn't trespass into the public sphere in a way that it's almost like liberal type of discussion, it's like, as long as it doesn't impose on others things that they don't want. So that's where the limitations come in. And the Islamic tradition with just ensuring that you cannot impose this on people. As long as it's not harming the rest of society, just let it kind of go along and just let people do their thing, and you only have your words to convince people. And you're not going to, and the Quran is also emphatically telling you, you're not going to guide everybody. You're not going to convince everybody. Some people are not. And that verse came to the Prophet Muhammad, who was struggling with his own family. And they weren't buying it. So
But if imposition is a problem,
I know where you're going with this. It's like there's imposition to some degree anywhere. People are imposing something everywhere. But that imposition is typically arrived at by a consensus of the community itself, by diverse communities coming together, living together. The atheist, the believer, the Christian, the Muslim, everybody that comes in and says, all right, we're going to negotiate this shared space together and establish limitations. We are having a rise of some right-wing, very extremist rhetoric in some politics where they're trying to ban certain things from people, and this is just personal practice that they want to do. It is problematic. And it's a difficult question again. Imposition happens to some degree. The question is, how do you determine it?